Hi guys, it's me, ChazzaHDF, and welcome to the final podcast of 2019 and the final live stream of 2019, where today, because obviously the decade of the 2010s is over, we are going to be reviewing the decade, the 2010s decade in Formula 1, looking at the championship battles. We'll look at, 2010, the four-way scrap, 2012, one of the best seasons ever, the Rosberg versus Hamilton years, and then the Hamilton-Vettel years, and how Mercedes and Red Bull especially really dominated Formula 1 in this decade. And then what we'll do after that is we will look at all the teams who have competed in this decade, except for a couple. We're not going to look at, for example, Manor, Caterham, teams like that. But then we'll go through, Mercedes, Red Bull, Ferrari, all those teams and how they did really during the decade. I just want to say as well, for this stream, if my microphone is coming in a bit loud, for some reason there's been some kind of adjustment on OBS. I don't know what's happened. So if I'm a bit loud, then just turn me down and it should be fine. But great to finally speak to you guys for the first time in a week, now that I can properly speak, because of course I cancelled this stream a week ago because of really bad toothache. And it was really bad. There was absolutely no way I could, do a stream with that level of toothache. I couldn't really speak. So, yeah, I had to cancel the stream. And, yeah, that's why we're doing it now. What is it? 2 days before Christmas Day? So, yeah, that's why I'm doing it now. But let me now bring in Nib. And, Nib, how you doing, mate? And, how are you getting on around Christmas?
Yeah, doing very well. Thanks. Thank you for asking, and I'm sure I speak for everyone here that glad that your toothache is gone after you got a little filling. But yeah, everything's doing good. Had a nice little weekend away, and then of course it's 6 a.m. on Christmas Eve here actually. So Christmas tomorrow. Yeah, it's going to be a good week, and I hope everyone else is going to have a good weekend, a good week, I should say.
Exactly. But hopefully everyone is, having a good week so far, and hopefully you'll have a good Christmas as well. But let's now get into the year on year, the championship battles during the decade, because at the start of the decade, I'm getting into it now, we had quite I think the start of the decade, definitely the championship battles were a lot more exciting. We'll start off, of course, in 2010. Four-way battle. It was at one point actually a five-way battle between Vettel, Webber, Alonso, Hamilton and Button. Button fell away because of a couple races where he just didn't quite have the pace and was not quite getting the results to remain, in the battle. So once we got to the final couple races, it was Vettel, Webber, Alonso, Hamilton, and of course at the final race, any four of them could win, and it was Sebastian Vettel who won the championship, even though coming into the final race, he had not led the championship at any point during 2010, even though during 2010, he had been so quick and got so many pole positions and had really looked like one of the favourites for the championship, even though, again, he had never led it at any point. So a fantastic achievement it was for Sebastian Vettel. And I believe he was the youngest world champion of all time at the time. You also had Mark Webber and Fernando Alonso right in there. Great drivers at there. Probably, maybe not with Fernando Alonso, but definitely Mark Webber. They were basically at their peak in 2010. Alonso did pretty well in 2010 to be in the battle, considering really how slow the Ferrari car was. And for Mark Webber, of course, he had his best season in Formula 1, no doubt about that. It's a shame he didn't get to win the championship, but I think Webber still had a great season. Lewis Hamilton, of course, actually led the championship for quite a long time in 2010. I think he led it from early June till about mid-September-ish time in 2010. So Lewis Hamilton also had a great chance of winning the 2010 championship, but it didn't happen. But 2010 was a great season, great championship battle. The races weren't the best of the decade, but there were definitely plenty of great races such as Canada, Korea, Abu Dhabi. The final race was a good one. Melbourne was another good one. Shanghai. plenty of good races, and the championship battle was maybe the best we've seen in the history of the sport, but definitely the best of the decade. I think this championship battle was in 2010. Nib, of course, I didn't watch Formula One back in 2010. I've had to, go back and watch it through the years. You watched it at the time. What, thinking back now, what were your thoughts of 2010 and that mega title fight?
Well, yes, certainly the best championship fight that happened during the decade. 5 drivers who could have won it into going into the final race. It was absolutely madness, and obviously at this stage of when I watched Formula One, I was very one-eyed. Let's put it that way. I was very Mark Webber all the way. So of course it was a very depressing end to the season. Of course, Turkey, where Vettel, absolutely what's the right word here? Absolutely, I'm trying not to say a word. Absolutely smashed Webber off the circuit at Turkey, and then of course we're not even mentioning a race in a certain Asian country. We're not even going to mention it. So yeah, it was a really, really incredible season. I really need to go back and watch even just the highlights of that season, because it was such an incredible season. I feel as if Webber had won that Turkish Grand Prix, I think he could have ran away with that championship, because I think that would have been 4 races or 3 races in a row that he'd won from the Spanish Grand Prix, Monaco. And then, I really think that Webber could have ran away with that championship. That was absolutely his best year in the sport. And sadly, it just wasn't good enough to beat Sebastian Vettel in the end.
Yep, it wasn't, even though Webber, you have to say, well, results-wise, for most of the season was looking like the man for Red Bull to win the World Championship. But of course, it didn't happen. And I think, again, 2010, in terms of title fights, you would have to say 2010 was the best season of them all. Then we got into 2011. Now, this is a season which I honestly think is one of the most underrated of the decade, because yes, Sebastian Vettel did dominate the season. We cannot doubt that whatsoever. Sebastian Vettel was very, very good. He basically won the championship after the first 4 or 5 races. And we cannot doubt that, he did dominate the season. But if you actually, go back and look at the races and the quality of the races, I think the quality of the races that season were very, very good. The races in Shanghai, where we had, I think, 3 or 4 different, potential race winners, Rosberg, Hamilton, Vettel, Button, all fighting for victory. Spain, where, of course, Alonso spectacularly got into the lead. Monaco was great, of course. Canada, Silverstone, Nürburgring. There were so many good races. The only, I guess, problem was that the same person kept winning them. But I honestly think 2011, and I went back, I think, last week, and I watched a couple races from 2011 because I do like that season in terms of the quality of the racing, and I don't understand why people... the championship battle was not interesting, of course, but the racing that season, honestly, I thought was so good. It was so good. There was never really a race where there wasn't a big battle for the race win or the podium. So I thought, honestly, 2011 was a great season. And I think it is... I'm not sure if it's the most underrated of the decade, but it's definitely one of the most underrated. Of course, again, championship battle was basically over after 3 or 4 races, but the races were great. And if you are a new Formula One fan and you haven't really seen races from, 2010, 2011, definitely go back and look at the races from 2011, because there are some races during that season where there is stuff happening all the time and you can't even keep up. So if you're a new Formula One fan, make sure to go and watch some races during that season. But don't you think that 2011, again, even though Vettel won a lot of it, it was a great season in terms of racing?
Well, Vettel didn't win a lot. He won everything that season. It was absolutely absurd. I can't honestly remember too much of 2011, but I do remember that we had some fantastic races. Nothing apart from Hockenheim, I think it was that year. Nothing super stands out vividly in my mind, but that's because I have watched a lot of Formula One, and I was only young at that stage, so. Yeah, I think that. Well, honestly think, as Will F1 has said in the chat, that was absolutely Vettel's best season in the sport. He was so dominant, just in complete and utter charge of the championship. I think he won 9 out of the first 11 races. He was just absolutely on fire that season. There was no stopping him. You see that the Ferrari was just awful that season. They really struggled. And yeah, it was ultimately a walk in the park for Vettel. Fantastic races, of course. Hamilton. That was the season where Hamilton and Massa crashed about 15 times.
Yeah, it was.
That was fantastic to see. I remember at India they crashed. At Singapore they crashed. Where else did they crash? They crashed everywhere.
Monaco.
At Monaco, I remember that. It was absolutely mental that season between Hamilton and Massa, and I think if you look back then, that Hamilton, it's a completely different Lewis Hamilton from 2011 to say even now in 2019. He's really gone on leaps and bounds, and I don't think we can say the exact same for Sebastian Vettel, can we?
No, we can't. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's almost like it's roles reversed of Hamilton and Vettel. Hamilton now is what Vettel was in 2011, and now Vettel is what Hamilton was in 2011, where Hamilton that season was very inconsistent. When he was on it, he was still right up there, one of the best drivers on the grid, no doubt about it. But there were so many races where he just couldn't get it together. He had an accident, or in qualifying, he messed up and ended up qualifying a bit lower down, than usual. It was a very inconsistent season. And it really has been from the start of the decade to now. It's basically just roles reversed. But now, and by the way, for people in the chat saying, yes, 2011 was it wasn't the first season I seen in Formula One. The first race I saw was in 2011, but I wouldn't class it as the first season that I watched Formula One, because I didn't really watch 2011. I watched Suzuka and then a couple races after that, but it wasn't, I didn't watch the entire season. But the first season I did watch, which for me, after going back and looking at plenty of races from past years, into the 2000s and 90s, the best season in Formula One, in my opinion, has to be 2012, where not only was the title battle so great, but the season in itself was unbelievably good. It was unbelievably good. It was, when you think back to 2012, it's hard to think like how it happened, like how it was so good, because I don't think we're ever going to get a season that unpredictable and that great ever again. Because, I mean, when have, since 2012, have we come into a race thinking like we did in certain races in 2012, where you thought, 4 or 5 different drivers or 4 or 5 different teams could end up going for victory? That's what 2012 was like. You didn't know what was going to happen. You didn't know who was going to win the races, what things were going to happen. There were so many surprises that season. Of course, 7 different winners in the first 7 races, including, of course, Pastor Maldonado. But with the title battle, there were many different drivers who were kind of flirting with, going for that title in 2012. You had Webber up there for the first half of the season. Then after he signed a new contract, he quite frankly disappeared. Kimi Räikkönen was consistent, but his car wasn't good enough. Lewis Hamilton, I thought in 2012 was very good, but his car and his team let him down continuously. So that meant that the only 2 that could really go for it was Sebastian Vettel and Fernando Alonso. Sebastian Vettel in the first half of 2012, honestly, was not that special. Mostly, I think, because the car was not really anywhere near the level it was the year before, and it was nowhere near as consistently good as it was in 2011. But Sebastian Vettel really, after I think Red Bull brought an upgrade around Singapore, that's when Red Bull really kicked on and got after Fernando Alonso, who, of course, led the championship for so long. He led the championship from, Monaco, I think, until Korea. I think Alonso led the championship the longest that season. And Alonso, we have to say as well, did an immense job in what was his best year in Formula 1, no doubt about it. To be in the fight, his car was, at the start of the season, the Ferrari was pathetic. It was an awful car. It was basically an upper midfield car. It got better during the season to the point where Alonso could be, consistently more up there fighting for race wins and podiums, and it wasn't as hard for Fernando to be in that position. But at the start of the season, that Ferrari was probably the worst Ferrari car we've seen during the decade. The one that they had for the first 4 or 5 races, it was so poor. And Fernando did so well to be in a position where he could go for the championship. And of course, the final race, what a final race it was. I honestly thought Vettel had lost it after contact, I think, with Bruno Senna. I was sure that Sebastian Vettel had lost the fight, and then somehow, in one of the best drives of his career and in Formula 1, came through to get enough points, with Fernando Alonso finishing second, to get his 3rd consecutive world title. But what a season, what a title fight. And Nib, surely 2012 has to be the best season of them all.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no disputing that 2012 was the best season of the decade. And, well, yeah, I was going to say the best season I watched. Well, I've been watching since 2009, so certainly is the best season that I've watched. And you're mentioning Ferrari, how awful they were at the start of the season. They were, I think in Australia, they're 1.1 second off pole. I can't remember who was on pole, but they're 1.1 second off pole. I remember that. They were absolutely abysmal that season with Ferrari. They're probably the 4th fastest team at the start of the season. And for Fernando to drive that well and only lose the championship by 3 points was quite remarkable. And I think the reason why Red Bull weren't as strong, of course, we know why they weren't as strong, is because the blown diffuser, where they blow the exhaust fumes from the diffuser down to the diffuser, creating a blown diffuser. They banned that, what was it, in Silverstone the year before, and that really affected Red Bull's performance at the start of 2012. They also brought in some new tyres, which I think why Sebastian Vettel struggled so much towards the start of the season, and why, say, his teammate Webber was really, really good up until about Silverstone, and then Vettel started to figure out the tyres, and yeah, he went from strength to strength, certainly after Italy, where he won 4 races in a row, and then, yeah, it was really that stretch where he won the championship. Alonso had a couple of retirements through no fault of his own, of course, in Belgium, when Grosjean obviously got turned on by Hamilton. We all know that Hamilton turned into Grosjean. Come on. And then, of course, he had his first retirement in Korea. So it was a couple of unfortunate retirements for Fernando, but it's part of the championship. You could very much say the same about 2010 with Vettel. He could have won that championship quite comfortably if he had retirements in Australia, many other races as well. But yeah, Vettel, incredible performance in the back end of the season to bring home that 3rd world championship in what was absolutely the greatest season that F1 has seen in modern history.
Absolutely, there is no doubt about it. And again, if there is any people watching who are new to Formula 1, you have to watch Formula 1 from that season. You have to. If you don't, then you are missing out on absolutely unbelievable races and moments from the decade and from Formula 1 history. It was that good of a season. But now we'll go on to the final year of the V8 era, which of course was 2013. Now, 2013, I think, is kind of similar, and I view it in a similar way to 2011, where, of course, Sebastian Vettel in the end did dominate the title fight. But in the first half of the season, which is different to 2011, Sebastian did not have that firm of a grip on the championship. He was leading the championship battle, but he was not miles ahead like he was after the first half of 2011. You had Alonso up there, Raikkonen, Hamilton, Rosberg, of course, won a couple races. So in the first half of the season, Vettel was not quite getting enough, say, results to be comfortable for the championship. But then, of course, after Pirelli made different compounds after the disaster that was Silverstone 2013, where their tyres were popping left, right, and centre, that really did help Red Bull go on to win every race after the summer break. The last race of the V8 era that Red Bull didn't win was Hungary, right before the summer break of Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes. So it just shows you how much that new compound, or the new way they made the tyre, really did help Red Bull. But I think, again, with 2013, if you look at the races, it was another very good season, and I enjoyed it quite a lot. Yes, the same guy won quite a lot of times, but the races were very, very good. At the start of the season, we had great races. I can't really remember a boring race in the first half of the season. I think every race had, great fights for the lead, controversies, of course, and we had many, different drivers fighting for podiums and race victories, which, of course, is what we want. In the second half of the season, when it came to fighting for victories, it did get a bit predictable, but still, the action was quite exciting, and I did enjoy 2013, and I think, looking back at it, even though the title battle was not really that great, or as great as it maybe could have been, if Alonso and Raikkonen or Hamilton had maybe better cars or had done a bit better at certain points of the season, I enjoyed the season. I thought it was exciting, and I thought we had some great races for sure in 2013. Nib, for 2013, do you agree that we had good races, but again, like 2011, it was just the same guy won?
Yeah. Well, how many races did Vettel win that season? I've actually got it up here. You won in Malaysia, Multi 21. He won in Bahrain. He won in Canada. He won in Germany, and then he won the last 9 races of the season. Absolutely mental how good Red Bull were. But yeah, I honestly don't remember too much of 2013. Towards the end, it was boring because Vettel literally won every single race. I certainly remember the first race being very good because I was at that Australian Grand Prix. Raikkonen, of course, won after Lotus were really, really good on their tyres that season. I do remember that quite vividly. We had sort of the emergence of Rosberg becoming a top tier driver. We got 4, I think it was 3 poles in a row from Bahrain, Spain, and Monaco. And of course, he won in Monaco. He won a couple of other races, I believe, as well that season. I think that was really the start of Nico Rosberg showing that he could be a top-tier driver, and certainly a sign of what was to come in 2014 and 2015, the years to come. And then, of course, it was sadly Mark Webber's final year in the sport. Very, very sad year, it must be said. But thankfully, for 2014, we got another mad Aussie in the Red Bull.
Yeah, you absolutely did. And with Mark Webber, I actually thought Webber in 2013 was pretty good. He had plenty of podiums that season. I know the Red Bull car was good, but I thought, honestly, he was quite good that season. It's a shame, of course, he didn't get that win, and he did deserve a win from that season. He was definitely good enough for a race victory, but I thought Webber was very good that season. But 2013, yeah, I thought it was a good year. And really, I think the post-2009 era up to, the end of 2013, I think was probably one of the most exciting periods of Formula One we've ever seen, because, of course, 2009, Brawn and all of that, and then we just reviewed 2010, 11, 12, 13, where even though a couple of the title fights were not that great, there were still great races, and there were plenty of great races that season, and I think that has to be, that era, that, 3 or 4 year period, that's got to be the benchmark for 2021 in terms of what we need to get back to in terms of the races on a consistent basis, being it, having races where we consistently have great fights for victory, podiums, down the field like we had during that time. That's what I want Formula One to get back to. And it is slowly getting back there, but it's not quite there as of yet. But then, Of course, once 2013 was over, it was then 2014, and a completely new era of Formula One had begun. And it was, of course, the V6 turbo hybrid era going into 2014. To be honest, I didn't, and I don't think anyone really knew what was going to happen. We had no idea, how the cars were going to react, how the drivers were going to do, because the cars were completely different to what they were pre-2014. But of course, from testing and the first couple of races, we saw clearly that Mercedes-Benz had the best car by an absolute mile. Red Bull had fallen off because of the Renault power unit. Ferrari fell off because of the entire car and team. We had a couple, teams rise up. Williams, Force India, mainly because of their power unit. And Mclaren, even though their power unit was Mercedes, they basically stayed the same. But it was, this period, 2014, 15 and 16, was clearly dominated by one team. And even though it was pure domination by one team, I do think the title fights between Hamilton and Rosberg were absolutely immense. And they were great drama, honestly, for Formula One. Again, they did have a car that was very dominant, and there were some races where when they weren't really going at each other, Hamilton and Rosberg, it could get boring because of how quick they were over the rest of the field. But I honestly thought the title fights were great between Lewis and Nico. We got so much drama, especially in 2014. We'll start off there. First off, of course, Monaco. Actually, no, we'll start with Bahrain. That great battle in Bahrain for the win, where, we didn't know who was going to win that race, but eventually, somehow, Lewis Hamilton did. Then the controversy in Monaco with Rosberg going down the escape road. And after that, it was really gloves off until the end of the season. And there were so many races that season where Hamilton and Rosberg went wheel to wheel, and that is quite a rarity, I think, in title fights nowadays, that you get to see the two main title contenders go wheel to wheel that much. Even in 2015, for example, they didn't go wheel to wheel as much as they did in 2014. You had Canada, where they were battling. I think Austria. Silverstone, of course, Rosberg's car failed him. But then after Hamilton had, I think, a brake failure and some failures in qualifying, then it came to Spa, where, of course, Lewis Hamilton was took out, according to Lewis Hamilton, on purpose. I'm not going to comment any further on that. But after that, that's really where it turned, because the reaction to what Rosberg did turned it in Lewis Hamilton's favour. Because Rosberg, even though he gained the 18 points, he did not gain any new fans from that Grand Prix or that Grand Prix weekend. And after that, Rosberg, even though he did have a couple reliability issues, because Hamilton had a couple of his own, I think, to be honest, it equaled itself out at the end. And I think Rosberg really just, after the tide had turned against him, he really did crumble. At Monza, of course, locked up at the chicane, lost the lead a couple times. I think it's Suzuka and Kota when they were fighting for the lead. And that, of course, gave Lewis Hamilton the lead going into the final race, that famous double points race. Thank God that didn't end in disaster. And then, of course, Lewis Hamilton won the Grand Prix and won the World Championship. But even though Nib, again, Mercedes dominated that season, that title fight between Lewis and Nico was very, very good.
Yeah, and I think people looking back on the Mercedes era of dominance really do forget just how good these title fights between Rosberg and Hamilton were. 2014 really actually was a pretty good season. I remember, of course, let's start out in Australia. Wet qualifying, we all absolutely lost our minds in the grandstand because we thought Ricciardo had podium, and no, the Mercedes snatched it away from us. So we'll start there. Start in Australia. That was a fantastic wet qualifying session. Always had a wet qualifying session in that era. At the Australian Grand Prix. I don't know why, but yeah, hopefully not as much rain in the future. Well, at least on that weekend. But yeah, at Bahrain, wow, absolutely breathtaking seeing them side by side for so long, and you could see just how full of adrenaline they were after that race, where they're hugging each other, celebrating because the battle was that good. And well, let's just say they weren't certainly doing that after Spa, were they? It certainly was the beginning of the downfall, the friendship, or the so-called friendship between Hamilton and Rosberg. Teammates since they were young, and that certainly did change quite dramatically throughout that season. We had some fantastic races. Of course, when I say fantastic races, I think of Canada, Hungary, Spa as well. Spa was fantastic as well. Hungary, I think, absolutely is one of the best races of the decade. Where Ricciardo, the wet race, where Ricciardo then, of course, overtakes Hamilton and Alonso, wasn't it, to win the race?
Yeah.
It was absolutely incredible stuff. Canada was fantastic because, of course, it was the first time that we seen like chink in Mercedes armor, where you've seen that their brakes were overheating, and of course Hamilton had to retire. Rosberg just about managed to keep it on the track, and then of course Ricciardo, after trying for so long, finally got past Rosberg down the back straight towards the final chicane. And yeah, that was an absolutely incredible race. 2014, probably one of the most underrated seasons, I think, out of all of them. It's certainly one that brings certainly lots of memories. Well, I mean, to the person who's just commented in the chat. Well, of course, because that is what does stand out to me. And we'll move to Spa, of course, the crash between Hamilton and Rosberg. So, I mean, of course, Rosberg didn't take him out on purpose, but absolutely Rosberg's fault with that one. And yeah, after that, Hamilton really did just went to another level, really. And I think that was kind of the first time we've seen this new Hamilton, where he was just so driven and focused on winning, because he's like, oh, this is real now. And yeah, well, he was absolutely fantastic. That season after Spa, it must be said. And in the end, he ended up winning the championship, and well, he's third world title, and well, he's just gone from strength to strength there, hasn't he?
Absolutely. This, as you say, it was really the start of the new Lewis Hamilton, because I think the old Lewis Hamilton, 2012, 2011-ish, I think after that crash of Rosberg, he probably not would have given up, but he would have got so down that I don't think he really would have recovered. And Rosberg probably would have hung on in the end. But of course, in Abu Dhabi, won his second world championship, and then the next year I think in 2015, that was definitely Lewis Hamilton. And we'll get onto it now. That was definitely, I think, one of his best years in Formula One, because even though, again, they had the best car, he had very tough competition from Nico Rosberg, who we cannot doubt was tough competition for Lewis Hamilton. And he, most of the season, completely dominated Nico Rosberg. Hamilton won, I think, 3 of the first 4 races in 2015, and Rosberg was not really ever close to Hamilton in those first 4 races. Then Rosberg, I think, won a couple races after that. And then once we got into, the European summer, and then going towards the autumn, Lewis Hamilton just completely trounced Nico Rosberg in the title fight, to the point where Rosberg's title chances were basically dead around the time of Spa or the Italian Grand Prix, and then Hamilton, of course, at the US Grand Prix, in what was another amazing Grand Prix in the V6 era, won the Grand Prix and won his 3rd world championship. But that year was probably the least good year out of the Hamilton-Rosberg years of fighting for the championship, mostly because Lewis Hamilton just completely dominated Nico Rosberg, and really he continued the momentum he had at the end of 2014, just carried it into 2015 and kept on it during the first 8, 9, 10 races. And that's why Rosberg was completely dominated, I think, in 2015, and that's why Rosberg at the end of the season, when he started winning races, that's what helped him in 2016. But 2015, I would have to say, was the worst season of the decade in terms of good races. There were good races, such as Hungary. That was a mental race. Silverstone was good. The US Grand Prix. But when you think back to 2015, there's not many races where you can say that was a good race. 2014, you can think of plenty. As Nib said, Bahrain, Canada, Hungary, Spa, even races at the end of the season, Brazil, the US Grand Prix was great that season. There wasn't that many boring races really in 2014. There was only, I'd say, 2 or 3 that I thought were really boring in 2014. But in 2015, it was horrifically bad. I think the first 8 or 9 races was so bad that I think for one of the races, I think it might have been Silverstone, I overslept when, trying to wake up to watch it because I wasn't as motivated to watch Formula 1 at the time because the races were so bad. So 2015 for me is without a doubt the worst season. I think one of the worst of all time, and I think definitely the worst of the decade. It was horrible, and thankfully the year after was a lot better and was, what Formula 1 was, a lot more like what Formula 1 is supposed to be. But Nib, surely for you, 2015's got to be the worst.
Yeah, absolutely. 2015 is very, very forgettable. I think, and of course, we haven't really mentioned this too much, but of course, Sebastian Vettel's first year at Ferrari, and I think probably one of his best seasons that he's had at Ferrari. Certainly during the start of the season, he was very strong. Of course, they won in Malaysia. They won in Malaysia, didn't they?
Yeah, that was his first win with Ferrari.
Yeah, his first win with Ferrari. 2015 was a pretty bang average season. I see Ricardo fan doesn't like 2015. Ha 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 ha. Yeah. But no, the races weren't fantastic in 2015. Certainly a very forgettable one. Not too many great battles between Hamilton and Rosberg like there was to come in 2016 or even in 2014. There were still some great races like Hungary. Hungary always produced a good race around this time period. USA Grand Prix was fantastic. It's usually always Bahrain, Hungary, and US Grand Prix that produce fantastic races. But yeah, I think that Sebastian Vettel really deserves a lot of credit for that season. He was always on the podium. I remember we've talked about this plenty of times off air. But he had so many podiums. Like in the first 9 races, I think he was on the podium 8 times or something like that. It was truly immense. And if Ferrari did produce a better car, I think that he could have challenged a little bit more strongly. But of course, Mercedes in the end were just a little bit too strong, and Hamilton just absolutely comfortably strolled, and was helped by, of course, a big gust of wind to his world championship.
Yeah, he was. I've just been reminded of that. That was hilarious. But I just want to ask, someone's brought up in the chat, I think it's Will F1. Out of Vettel and Hamilton, who would you say was the better driver that season? It's hard to say for me.
I think you still got to give it to Hamilton just because of how dominant he was in terms of winning the championship. Yes, he had the better car, but I think you still have to give it to Hamilton. I'd have to go back and watch though. That's just off my pure memory, which isn't very good with 2015.
Well, I thought Vettel. I think that 2015 personally was Sebastian Vettel's best season because he was in a car that was not the best, but he was in a car that he had to be at his best to be on the podium, because let's not forget that he did have Kimi Raikkonen as his teammate, who I thought was pretty good that season, and he had the 2 Williamses there, and there was a few races at the end of the season where Red Bull were very competitive, so it's not like he had no competition for 3rd or 4th place. I thought Vettel that season, honestly, if he in, say, 2017 or 2018 performed like he did in 2015, I think he would have probably won one of those championships. I thought he was that good. It is hard to say, though, because Lewis Hamilton's car was so much faster than Sebastian Vettel, so I don't think I can really say, because, again, the Mercedes car was, 7 tenths, 8 tenths quicker than the Ferrari on a normal day that season. There were a couple races where Ferrari could take the fight to them, but on a normal day, Mercedes were about 3/4 of a second clear. So, yeah, But definitely, those two drivers, Hamilton and Vettel, were the best drivers of that season. But let's now get into the final year of the Hamilton versus Rosberg battles, 2016. And this is, I honestly think 2016 is the best season of the, those 3 years where Hamilton and Rosberg were going at it for the World Championship. 2016 was a great season, another very underrated one. There were so many good races that season where not only were Mercedes going for victory, but also you had Ferrari in there, you had Red Bull, and the midfield as well was so close. You had Williams, Force India, Toro Rosso, McLaren all going at it so closely. Even new team Haas was in there. I remember in Bahrain, I think Grosjean finished in 5th place in Bahrain in their 2nd ever Grand Prix, which at the time was truly mental. But yeah, 2016, honestly, I think it's the best season between 2014 and the new aerodynamic regulations that came for 2017 and after that. So many great races. I remember the Australian Grand Prix. We had, even though Mercedes locked out the front row, it was a Ferrari 1-2 for quite a few laps. An amazing start to that Grand Prix. Bahrain, there was plenty of drivers and teams going for the podium. I remember Williams and Red Bull and Ferrari, and again even Haas. China was great. Obviously with the Spanish Grand Prix where Hamilton and Rosberg collided and Max Verstappen got his first ever race victory. What a race that was. Monaco was great, even though Nib will not talk about it. Canada was also great. Hamilton versus Vettel, that race was. Then we had a great fight for the podium as I think Rosberg dropped down to 12th or 13th after the start. I think if you look at 2016, you can't really think of that many boring races. I can only think really of 2 or 3 that I would say were properly boring, which would be Baku, Hungary, and then after that I'd probably say maybe Russia. I mean, I know the start of the race was chaotic, but after that I didn't think it was an amazing Grand Prix. But definitely Baku and Hungary were probably the absolute worst races of that season, but every other race was quite frankly very good. And with the title fight, again, in a similar way to Hamilton in 2015, what Rosberg did was he ended 2015 the way Hamilton ended 2014, and that's why Rosberg ended up starting the season at a higher level than he did in 2015. Lewis Hamilton did have a lot of bad luck during 2016, I think, and I still, to this day, I still think Nico Rosberg was not deserving of the championship. I don't think he was the better driver. I think Lewis Hamilton was the better driver. Rosberg was good. Hamilton was not at his best. There were a couple of races where Lewis was definitely nowhere near the best of his talent, but I still thought Lewis Hamilton that season was the better driver. But Rosberg really, I thought he executed the season mentally very well. Again, first 4 races, won them all in really dominant fashion, wasn't really challenged at all for the victory. And then once he fell off mid-season, he used Hamilton's bad luck to his mental advantage by striking, against Hamilton very quickly. For example, after Hamilton blew up in Malaysia, the week after, we had the Japanese Grand Prix, and what Rosberg did mentally, I have to say, was brilliant, because he got pole position quite comfortably, and then in the race, after Hamilton got a poor start, Rosberg won the race comfortably. So he, continued that swing mentally that happened around that time. And I think Rosberg definitely, he won the mental fight in 2016. But I think in terms of pure driving, I thought Lewis Hamilton was better, because if you look at the period between Spain and, say, Spa or Monza, I thought Lewis Hamilton during that period was, at his best. And I thought Nico Rosberg during that period of the season was actually quite bang average, to be honest. There was plenty of races where he wasn't even on the podium during that time. So, yeah, I still to this day don't think Rosberg deserved to win it, but factually he did, so my opinion doesn't matter. But yeah, Nib, what did you think of this season then, Hamilton versus Rosberg? And also, the other teams, you'd have to say, during this season actually closed the gap to Mercedes and provided them with a bit more of a fight.
Well, yes, of course. 2016 was a great season. We won't talk about a certain race where a certain team had a certain pit stop, which a certain driver was absolutely screwed over. Yes, we won't talk about that anymore. But yeah, what an incredible season it was. Rosberg giving it absolutely everything he got. He scratched and he clawed. He literally did absolutely everything he could to get the win. And you have to give him so much credit for winning the championship. To win a championship over a whole season against Lewis Hamilton is no mean feat. And it was incredible. It still is an incredible achievement. We're seeing Valtteri Bottas, who I think we all rate as a pretty good driver, get absolutely nowhere near Lewis Hamilton in terms of championship battle. And for Rosberg to win the championship against Hamilton, even though Hamilton, of course, did have some reliability issues, well, certainly a little bit more than Rosberg, you have to give so much credit to Rosberg. And I think Rosberg honestly doesn't get the credit he deserves for winning the championship against Hamilton that season. Of course, he had a very, very good start to the season where he won. Did he win the first 4 races? I think it was.
Yeah.
He had such a strong start to the season. Did Rosberg, and he didn't have a great mid part of the season as you spoke about. I remember Hockenheim actually, where he was quite horrendous, where him and Verstappen came to blows. I remember that quite vividly down at the hairpin, and I think Rosberg got penalised for that as well, didn't he? And I think he fell off the podium and got 4th place that race. But yeah, it was an incredible championship battle. I just wish that we could have this, say, next season or in 2021, because the racing has been good the last couple of seasons, but it's just lacked a championship battle. It's just lacked someone to be able to go toe-to-toe with Lewis Hamilton over a whole entire season. And the fact that Rosberg did that, it has to be congratulated so much. And I think Rosberg doesn't get the credit he deserves. And yeah, what an incredible season it was. Even though it was arguably one of the better championship battles of the season, I don't think it's even in the top 3 of the whole entire decade. I think that's just how good you say 2010 and 2011 certainly were. I think you can make a case for it being the 3rd best season of the decade. But I think after 2016, I think we just all want a championship battle like that once again.
Yeah, we want it really to go down to the final race like it did, because we want that excitement. Because when you have a final race title decided, you have no idea, what is going to happen. You have no idea what's going to happen. Like, I don't think many people going into the final title decider in 2010 thought Sebastian Vettel was going to win it. I think people mostly thought it was really Alonso versus Webber, and after qualifying, Alonso would get it. And that's the beauty of a final race title decider. It can go really any way in that final Grand Prix. But then, after 2016, we had new technical regulations, aerodynamic technical regulations, which really did move these cars on in terms of speed. And it allowed Mercedes to actually be challenged a lot more by Ferrari and Red Bull during 2017 and also 2018, which we will get into in a moment. But Lewis Hamilton did win in 2017, his 4th world title, and the title fight that season was probably the best title fight we got between Hamilton and Vettel. I think definitely those two were a lot more racy with one another that season. They were a lot closer to each other on track as well, and they were plenty of times in 1st or 2nd place fighting for, race victories and trying to stake a claim in the championship fight. And we had plenty of flare-ups, of course. We had Spain, where they had a great battle for the race victory, where Lewis did get lucky with the virtual safety car, but the battle was immense. Baku, of course, of Vettel turning into Hamilton. And then I think after that, in Baku, I think that's probably where Lewis Hamilton slowly but surely started to turn the tide against Sebastian Vettel, because even though in Austria, I think that was the race after Baku, Vettel beat Hamilton, I think Vettel really, after that, struggled to beat Lewis in any Grand Prix there was only, I think, 2, 3, maybe 4 at most races after Austria where Vettel actually beat Lewis Hamilton in a Grand Prix. So I think Baku really was... I mean, Singapore as well was a key moment, but I think Baku was the first big turning point that really did turn the tide against Sebastian Vettel. And Singapore basically finished Vettel off in the title fight. Vettel did get unlucky, of course, with a couple of reliability issues in Malaysia and Suzuka. But that season, Ferrari, you have to say, had the car. They had a driver who that season, even though he had, made those couple errors, he was still very good that season, in my opinion. They had the driver, they had the car, but once it got to, the part of the season where you've really got to produce your best form, they dropped off to probably their worst, point of the season. And of course, after that, Ferrari have not recovered since Singapore 2017, or maybe even you could say Baku 2017. But yeah, Ferrari, I think honestly in 2017 with a car that was very good, it was a very, very good car, and plenty of times it was just as fast as the Mercedes car, if not faster, especially in the race. I remember in the races, not so much in qualifying, but in the races, Ferrari had a very, very quick car. They just didn't maximize the potential they had. And it is quite sad because I think honestly that season was probably the year. If Vettel was going to get it done at Ferrari, I think that was the year it was going to happen, because after Hamilton had beat Vettel that season and had, after Vettel had committed mental errors, I think Lewis had Sebastian kind of in his pocket mentally after this season. So this was Ferrari and Sebastian Vettel's massive opportunity, and you have to say, altogether, they really did blow it. But the title fight that season I still thought was good. Not as good as Hamilton-Rosberg, but it was still good. But Nib, really, between Hamilton and Vettel, it did really come down, didn't it, to mentality.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a great season between Ferrari and Mercedes. Finally, we've seen Mercedes actually challenged over a whole season by another team, which was fantastic to see. Vettel was super, super strong all the way up until really Singapore in 2017. But Crystal Racing reminds me very brilliantly here that it wasn't, after Singapore, of course, where it started to all go downhill, it wasn't only Vettel, it was indeed Ferrari who made massive mistakes. They brought an engine upgrade for the Malaysian Grand Prix, and there was a massive issue with it, which cost him qualifying in Malaysia and then Japan in the race. And then after that, the championship battle was all over. So it was not only Vettel, I think people forget this, who really threw away the World Championship. It was also the team. And I think this season was absolutely the best chance for Ferrari to win the championship, because they actually had a better car than Mercedes in the corners. It was absolutely the best car that Ferrari produced in terms of actual raw speed in the corners. It was seen in 2019 that the engine was super, super quick, but I think in 2017 the actual car itself was the best it's been. And yeah, I think that was really Ferrari's golden opportunity to win the world title of this decade, but they just ultimately couldn't grasp the opportunity with both hands. And Vettel and Ferrari at the end of the day threw it away, and hasn't that been a common theme ever since? But also the start of the rise of Verstappen and Red Bull, you started to see that Red Bull and Renault were starting to get things a little bit back together, and we've seen Verstappen challenging quite a bit more for race victories, and yeah, of course, Verstappen, he really has just gone from strength to strength. It's been mentally, he's in the sport for 5 years now. I don't know where on earth the time has gone. And when you mentioned earlier on in 2014 when Rosberg went down the escape road in Monaco, I'm like, was that really 2014? The time has absolutely flown through the decade, and Yeah, well, time has flown because this season here, Singapore, it actually seems like an absolute age ago now. So, yeah, 2017, ultimate disappointment for Ferrari. And once again, just Hamilton proving too strong.
Absolutely. And yeah, you say with time flying, Singapore 2017 feels like it was 5 years ago to me. And the V8 era feels like it was 10, 15 years ago. It feels like a pastime at the moment, even though it was, what, 7, 8 years ago? Which is quite a long time. But yeah, the Rosberg-Hamilton fights, for example, do feel a long, long time ago. And I think it does show you that, especially Formula One as of late, has been a lot better than it has been, say, around 2015, because it's made us kind of forget how good Formula One was, maybe, towards the start of the decade. But 2018 really was just the same as 2017, with better races, of course. But in terms of the championship battle and the pace of the cars, it really just continued off from 2017. Mercedes and Ferrari had two cars that were, I'd say, equally matched most of the time. There were races where Ferrari would be a lot quicker or Mercedes would be a lot quicker, but most of the time, it was an equal battle. And it did come down to drivers. And Lewis Hamilton, once again, had Sebastian Vettel mentally in his pocket, and Sebastian Vettel and Ferrari, as a combination, completely blew the World Championship. But Lewis Hamilton, I think, during 2018... was at his absolute best. In 2019, which we'll get onto, I think we'll get onto in a moment, even though we've already, mostly talked about it before. In 2019, Hamilton was great, but he wasn't at his absolute best. And he didn't really have to be, because he was only racing one person in the World Championship. Was racing, Leclerc, Vettel, Verstappen, plenty of times during the season. But for the championship, he was racing one person, his teammate, who he knew he could beat, as long as he half the time, produced his best form. So 2018 for me is his best season, because this season, over the course of the season, I think the Ferrari car was slightly faster as an overall package. I think, as Nib said, in 2017, Ferrari did have aerodynamically a better car. But overall, aerodynamically and power unit wise, I think Ferrari did have the better car than Mercedes did, even though the Mercedes car was still very good. And Lewis Hamilton, in plenty of races, had to be at his absolute best and maximise his talent to still outscore Sebastian Vettel. For example, the Italian Grand Prix, one of the best performances of his career, beating the two Ferraris on their home turf, even though the Ferrari cars were faster in qualifying, and really that weekend. Singapore, of course, great weekend. And at that end of the season, time and time again, Lewis Hamilton rose to the top and produced his best form to continuously outscore Sebastian Vettel, despite the car he was driving not really being that quick. I mean, at the end of the 2018 season, the Mercedes at times was not even the second best car. At certain races, it was probably the third best car behind the Red Bull and the Ferrari in certain races like Mexico or the Brazilian Grand Prix. But still, Hamilton was right up there, getting the job done. But as we said with Ferrari, they just didn't produce the form and the results that they needed to. And they really needed to this season, because I think overall they had a faster car than they did compared to Mercedes in 2017. And yeah, they just didn't get it done. They did not get it done. And it's such a shame, because again, there was so much potential from this Ferrari car in 2018. It was a really good car, but they just couldn't, on enough occasions, get it out of the car and produce the results that the car deserved. And I think if you actually look at 2018, the races they did win, it was kind of harem scarum, their wins. They never really dominated a Grand Prix at all during 2018, when they really should have been a bit more comfortable during that season. But we know it's Ferrari. They're, horribly mismanaged from the top down. So that's why Ferrari completely blew it in 2018. But yeah, the title fight was basically the same as it was in 2017. And again, Nib, Hamilton mentally had Vettel in his pocket, but I think you said this before, haven't you, that Lewis Hamilton was at his best in 2018?
Well, you're literally, you've taken the words out of my mouth. Absolutely, this is Lewis' best season. Ferrari, at the majority of the races, in my opinion, just the majority, had the better car. And Hamilton had to be these absolute best to win the championship this year. And in the end, he did quite comfortably. And absolutely Lewis Hamilton's best season in the sport. And that's why I say that in 2019, he wasn't absolutely his best, because in 2018, he was absolutely unreal. Vettel and Ferrari absolutely should have won the championship this year if they had executed their season properly, but they didn't. They threw it away in the end, and well, I'm still lost for words at how good Hamilton was that season. I need to go back and watch, because Hamilton, next level, out of this world. His performance was in 2018. As you can see, I'm still lost for words. That's a photo of Monaco. Not Monaco, certainly not Monaco, Mexico on the screen there.
It's actually
what
Canada.
That it's Canada.
First
I
two
thought
corners.
it was. Oh yes, it is actually. I thought that it was Mexico, but never mind. There we go. I've had an absolute mare there, but yeah, I remember now Bottas and Verstappen side by side there. But yeah, well, I still can't believe how good he was that season. And oh god, I've just been reminded about Baku. Oh dear. Well, that was interesting, wasn't it? Where the two Red Bulls came colliding together, where Verstappen was a little bit naughty with Ricardo, but still, it was kind of both their faults at the end of the day. I'm going to be honest with you, but yeah, I for some reason I honestly can't remember too many of the races off the top of my head. I do this quite often. I watch the race, I think about the race for a couple of days, and then it's literally just lost and forgotten in my mind. So honestly, not too many races stand out from 2018. I do not know why. So I don't know if you want to refresh me about some races that were good. That would be nice.
Bahrain was good. Obviously Shanghai, where Ricardo won the race.
How can we not forget about that? Yeah.
Baku was good, even though of course Red Bulls collided. You had fight for the victory, was great. Midfield was so close. Remember the Renaults actually could fight Red Bull in that Grand Prix. And then we had a boring patch for a few races. Then Austria, Verstappen won his first race. Silverstone was amazing. That was where Vettel passed Bottas at the end. Hockenheim, of course, Vettel's mistake. Monza, Hamilton's amazing victory. And then where else? US Grand Prix, Raikkonen's what's going to be his last victory in Formula 1, let's be honest.
Yes.
And then, yeah, Mexico was good. Brazil was my favourite of the season, where Max really should have won that race from P5 on the grid.
Oh, yeah.
It was a pretty good season. I'm not sure compared to 2019 whether I'd say it was better, but I enjoyed it. I thought 2018 was pretty good.
Yeah, well, I don't know whether or not it's just because it is 7 a.m. for me and I've been up for some time now, or it's just I literally can't remember anything. I think I honestly have the worst memory when it comes to remembering stuff about previous F1 seasons, and I really don't know why. But now, of course, you bring up, of course, Ocon and Verstappen. How could I honestly forget about that? Baku was fantastic. Of course, China, where Ricardo won in spectacular style. And I think this is quite a big talking point of this. We've talked about it many times, but after Monaco 2018, Max Verstappen became a completely different driver, and it was really the starting point of Max's new career in the sport. I'd like to say he found himself much like Hamilton did. Say after he left McLaren in that second season with Mercedes in 2014. So yeah, it was a very important year for Max. I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit more on that, but yeah, if you want to, go ahead.
Yeah, with Max, as you say, I think he had like a Hamilton 2011 season, kind of. I mean, he didn't have it for as long as Hamilton did, but he basically came to a point where he had to make changes, or else he was not going to be a great driver. I think Max, his speed is unbelievable and his talent is unbelievable, but he wouldn't, if he didn't make the changes necessary, he wouldn't go on to be as good as he is now, or as good as his talent, deserves him to be later on in his career. So I think, yeah, as you said, Max, after Monaco, he turned into a completely different driver. And I think since really that Monaco Grand Prix, there's been so many races where Red Bull have not been that quick and he's been up there in a podium position. I remember this race, Canada, where Red Bull were not that quick compared to the other two top teams. And he was, I think, like a tenth or half a tenth off pole, even though the Red Bull Renault was severely down on power. But he was right up there and very close to victory as well in terms of time. So, yeah, this was, as you say, a real turning point for Max Verstappen, and he had to make it, because if he didn't, then he would still be, during 2019, making the same mistakes over and over again, like Sebastian Vettel's doing. And I think with Vettel, what Vettel hasn't done is what Verstappen and Hamilton have done. They hit a point of their career, like a crossroads, where they need to make, the necessary changes to their driving style, or just the way they do things, their mentality, to improve. Hamilton and Verstappen did that, and you can see, the improvement Hamilton's made, and Max. Sebastian hasn't done that, and because Sebastian is now on the back end of his career, I mean, if he does finally realise, Sebastian, what he can do differently, then maybe, he can have a couple, final good seasons in the sport if he gets to the end of his career. But as long as Sebastian doesn't make the necessary changes, then I don't really see how Sebastian Vettel improves going forward in Formula One. He just needs to, again, make the necessary changes, what Max and Lewis did, and we should see Sebastian at a better level. But until then, ain't going to happen. But I think now we'll get into the final season 2019, and, well, we've already talked about 2019 earlier this month. If you haven't seen our review of the 2019 Formula 1 season, which I think was 2 episodes ago, episode 54, I think it was, make sure to go and check that out, as that is a 2-hour review of 2019. All the teams, all the drivers, all the moments, all of that stuff. Yeah, 2019, great season, many great races. The championship battle, though, was quite poor. Probably one of the worst of the decade, mostly because Red Bull and Ferrari started off with a car that was not able to compete. And if they did have a car from the start of the season that was able to compete, I'm sure people have seen out there if the championship started in Austria, things on Twitter or other places. If Red Bull and Ferrari had started the season with a car that was, say, half a second closer, I think we would have had at least maybe Max Verstappen up there competing for the World Championship. But because Mercedes started the season like a house on fire, there was no real chance that, Red Bull or Ferrari were going to do anything. Ferrari, of course, continued to do the same things and wonder why they're not getting any better. That's called insanity. And Red Bull, with their new partnership with Honda, of course, had a great season, a great first year. But, guys, before we get into the individual teams, I'm going to quickly come to you guys in the chat to see what you guys think of, certain battles, certain seasons. So let me quickly have a look. And then, and then we'll get on to all the teams and how they've done during the decade, really. Right. Let's find some comments here if I can. Chaz probably tried to assassinate Ocon after Brazil. No, that's not true. Crystal Racing, Kimi will win in an Alpha. I don't know how, but he will. I was kind of hoping that Kimi would get the luck, I guess you'd call it, in Hockenheim and get the win, because if anyone remembers that race, Kimi was, I think, right up there in the top 5, top 6. basically the entire race until the end where Alfa pitted him too late for dry tyres. I was kind of hoping that would be the race Kimi would get a surprise podium or surprise victory. And also Brazil, I was kind of hoping for that as well, because I think it would be great to see Kimi get an unexpected podium, because I think, to be honest, at the moment, we all kind of think that Kimi's last win is, going to be that US Grand Prix, and his last podium in his career will be that one in Brazil in 2018. Hopefully they were wrong. Hopefully he can get one, and then we can celebrate it once again. By the way, Nib, how are you coping with 50 degrees of heat? If you're listening.
I'm here. What was it? It was 44 the other day. And then in a couple of days it's gonna be like 45 3 days in a row. But you just cope with it. You sit your bum in front of the air conditioner all day, and you just do whatever you want to do.
I'll be honest. I said this to you on Twitter, didn't I? I would absolutely
no,
love.
You don't.
Yes,
you don't.
I would.
You don't. You wouldn't.
I'll ask you that. Would you rather what I'm having at the moment, which is what?
Yes.
2 degrees Celsius and flooding.
Okay, maybe not flooding, but I'd rather 2 degrees. Yes.
Okay. Well,
because you can actually just put more clothes on, whereas it's not like you can take less clothes off, you can you just can't.
I'm a hot weather person. I love the summer. Right, let's find some other comments here, then we'll get onto the teams. Mostly an F1 fan. Silverstone 2018 was one of my favourites. Seeing the Mercs and Ferrari separated by nothing in the closing stages, it was almighty. It was a great race, that was. Right, let's find a couple more. Crystal Racing 2010 was my favourite season of the 2010s, the last year of the Bridgestone tyres before the DRS and KERS gimmicks appeared. Yeah, 2010 in terms of, I guess you could call it real racing, was the last real season, I guess you could call it. Be interesting to think, because the cars in 2011 were not the same as the cars in 2010, but they had, they were very similar. Would have been interesting to see, what would have happened with DRS and KERS if they were in 2010. Of course, we had KERS in 2009, and then in 2010, I think in 2010 KERS weren't banned. It was just, do you want to use them? And I don't think anyone decided to use them, but then they made them mandatory for 2011. So it would have been interesting to see.
Don't forget the F duct.
Yeah, exactly, the F duct. Who had it? McLaren,
yeah.
Renault had it. Ferrari had it. I think Red Bull had it, but it wasn't as effective as the others. But I remember McLaren and Renault for sure, because I remember Robert Kubica going one-handed through Eau Rouge. And I remember him, I think, in Singapore when he had a late puncture, he came back through the field and he was going through the kink on that DRS straight one-handed, but right behind Barrichello, which was mental as well. Yeah, there was a few teams with that. And I remember as well, obviously, we talked about blown diffusers earlier. You had, most of the teams at the end of the season had it, but there was one team that I thought their blown diffuser was great, was the Renault. And they had, I think, was it the front blown diffuser they had at the end of that season, and the sound of that was just absolutely incredible. So, and I think there's a clip of it on this site as well. So if anyone wants to go and watch it, make sure to do so, because the sound is absolutely incredible. But right, let's find one more comment and then get on to the teams. Top 3 teams of 2010s: HRT, Marussia, and Virgin Racing. Will F1, this is the order how I rate every season. 2012 first, and then 2010, 2018, 2016, 2019, 2017, 2011, 2014, 2013, 2015. And Crystal Racing has done the same. So 2010, 2012, 2018, 2016, 2019, 14, 17, 11, 13, 15. I'm not sure what I'd go for the entire decade, but for the first three, the top three seasons, I'd probably say 2012 first. Second, I would go 2016, and then third, I would probably go. I'm not sure. Maybe 2019 or 2011. And I'm thinking about by the way, I'm thinking about the racing, not necessarily the title fight. I'm definitely the top two for me is 2012 and 2016. But I think now is about time we get into the teams and how they did during the decade. Now, the order we're going to go in is a bit different to obviously what we did normally for 2019. It's basically based on, say, the most, I guess, successful of the decade. So let's first get into Mercedes-Benz, who of course have dominated Formula One since 2014. Before 2014, though, let's get into that because people don't talk about it that much. 2010 and 2011, of course, Mercedes, as a works team, came back into Formula One. Those first couple years were pretty tough. They were pretty tough for the Silver Arrows because they had a car that was nowhere near as good as they wanted it to be, and it was nowhere near as good as the Brawn was. That was of course the team they took over at the end of 2009. So those first couple years were very tough, and I think they definitely were underachieving, and I think you have to give credit to them. They didn't have it easy. They didn't have an easy road to their dominance. They had to really work for it and set out a long-term plan. That's what they basically did to get to where they got to by 2014. 2012, of course, they won their first Grand Prix since they came back. Got a pole position as well. I'm still counting it. With Rosberg and then Michael Schumacher, of course, at Monaco. And then 2013, they became, I think, a proper front-running team. And then, of course, from 2014 on, they dominated Formula One. And I think the most impressive part of the decade for this team really has been from 2017 on, because they've had a lot tougher competition from Ferrari and Red Bull. They've still continued to maintain that great level. And I think 2019 actually is their best season ever as the Mercedes Works team, because if you look at 2019, I know in the first 8 races they were very dominant, but if you look at the course of the season, there weren't that many races where they were dominating the weekend. Bahrain and Canada and power tracks, Ferrari were right there, if not faster than them. Plenty of races where Red Bull and Max Verstappen were right up there, giving them a hard time. But still, they ended up winning, 16 or 17 of the 21 races? So for me, 2019 is their most impressive season because they were still able to dominate despite the pace of the car not being as dominant as it was in 2014 or 2015. So 2019 was an amazing season, quite frankly. And this team is, without a doubt, the best team of the decade. One of the best, and I think, honestly, they're the best team in Formula One history. And I think going forward into the next decade, certainly at the start of the decade, it's very hard to see this team being defeated. Definitely going into next year. But Nib, for this team, as I've said, they've just completely dominated the sport since 2014.
Well, yeah, even up until about after Hungary in 20. Sorry, I can't even speak properly. Up and from Hungary after. No, what am I even saying? In 2013, they were very good. They were very good. They were faster than Red Bull for large parts of the first half of the season. But then after Hungary, round of applause for myself. I finally got out what I was trying to say. They were very good, and they were challenging Red Bull quite a bit, but Red Bull in the end was still just a bit too strong. Of course, 2012, where they finally won their first race back as Mercedes since, back in the old days when, what was it, the 60s, where they won their last race. Rosberg, very, very well done to win that race in China. A fantastic image where he's standing on top of the car with the wheel in his hand. That I think that's quite an iconic image from 2012 that year. And yeah, they just went from strength to strength. Best team of the decade, absolutely, and statistically, arguably the most dominant and most successful F1 team or era dominance in F1 history. I don't think you can doubt that for how dominant they've been for such a long period of time. You just cannot bet against Mercedes. That's for sure. You just cannot bet against Mercedes. They are just the perfect machine. They run so well. They barely make mistakes. They just produce a good car every single year. If a great engine, if not the best engine, every single year. They just are the best team in the sport, and the best run team. They're just fantastic. Mercedes aren't. I don't think anyone can question that they are absolutely the best team of the decade.
Yeah, without a doubt, Mercedes just unbelievably good. And I think if you compare them to Red Bull, who we'll go on to now, Red Bull were, of course, dominant in 2012, 11, 12, 13 in terms of championships. But if you actually look at 1-2 finishes and the results they got, they weren't anywhere near as dominant, in my opinion, as Mercedes were. They weren't as clinical, I guess you could say, as Mercedes were. But yeah, Red Bull, between 2010 and 2013, were definitely the best team. They had most of the time the best car. In 2010, even though they made a very hard job of it, they did deserve to win the championship. They had clearly the best car that season, but they bottled it so many times in 2010. 2011, clearly again, best car, dominated the season. 2012 was their hardest season, and they, with the great work of Adrian Newey, bringing upgrades late on in the season, that helped them just about get the Constructors and the Drivers' World Championship. And then, of course, in 2013, they, dominated that season as well. And then, of course, after 2014, they have not won a World Championship or even competed for one. Now, people may say, well, this is where Red Bull's, performance goes down. But I don't honestly blame the 2014 and, after that period on Red Bull, mostly because we've seen in the V6 hybrid era, you can have a car that is aerodynamically efficient and brilliant, but if you do not have the power, you're not going to, reach that level that you're wanting to go to. And that's why Red Bull have not been able since 2013 to even think about competing for the World Championship. So, and that's, that's why they've gone with Honda, and that's why Honda, if they can improve, that'll help Red Bull get back to that level. Because Red Bull, I don't think, have dropped off in terms of their performance level. There has been a couple years where aerodynamically they haven't produced a great car. 2015, 2017 at times, their cars have been great, but I don't think the level of the Red Bull team as such has actually dropped. I just think it's, their team, their partnership with Renault and all that stuff, they just were in the wrong place at the wrong time to compete after 2014. And that's why eventually they had to get rid of Renault and go with Honda to climb their way back up to that level after climbing down from that level because of Renault in 2014, 15, 16, 17, and 18. So, again, I don't think Red Bull have necessarily got worse. I just think, again, they just haven't had the power to compete. And I think if you gave Red Bull, if you had an engine supplier, and hopefully Honda do give them this going into the next decade, or another engine supplier if they ever get one, if they do get enough power to match their aerodynamic grip they normally have, then Red Bull will be back at a World Championship competing level. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. They still got a great team, great group of mechanics and engineers, and Christian Horner is still a great team principal. They've got good drivers. Just again, if they've got the power, they will be there. But I think you have to say, Nib, again, after the first 4 years of dominance where they, were great, it has really been about, lack of power, really, hasn't it, since the V6 era began?
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think a big part of that was Renault were pushing their engine development so hard, still so late into the V8 era, and that's why you know Mercedes and even Ferrari were able to get that advantage on them. But ultimately, even though they still had time, to catch up Renault, but they ultimately just didn't do it. And Red Bull have absolutely made the right decision by going with Honda power for the foreseeable future. That is for sure. But yeah, Red Bull, absolutely the second best team of the decade. And certainly at the start of the decade, I don't think anyone that would be saying that. Red Bull were so good those 4 years of dominance. And even for the majority, for about half of 2009 as well, they're absolutely fantastic. Of course, not part of this decade, though. They had fantastic drivers. Sebastian Vettel absolutely on top of his game, especially in 2011. Webber, a fantastic driver. Then you have Ricciardo, of course. Then the madness starts happening, where you go from Kvyat to then Verstappen, who's proven himself to be a fantastic driver. And I think that he can absolutely lead Red Bull into the future if Red Bull, start to get that act together a little bit more. Because I think that Red Bull, as the team is still run exceptionally well, but I still think that they can do a better job with the actual car. I still think that in some parts that it is still lacking, especially in the slower speed corners. Actually, I think that's where Red Bull do struggle than others. So I think that if Red Bull can, start to get everything pieced together, I think they really can have a good next decade. But what a fantastic team Red Bull have been, from a little energy drinks company in Austria to then winning 4 back-to-back world and constructors and drivers world championships. Truly a great story. Christian Horner proving himself as one of the best team principals in the sport. It was an incredible decade for Red Bull, and they'll certainly look back on it with fond memories, and they'd be hoping to start to replicate that going into the next decade.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you told anyone, and told even Red Bull going into the 2010s decade, the end of 2009, that they would be basically every season in a position to win races and win 4 drivers and constructors world titles, they would have said absolutely no chance. Even though they had a very quick car around, the end of 2009, I don't think they believed that they would ever get it because, Ferrari and McLaren at the time were such a force still. But yeah, Red Bull, I think even though now they're viewed as a top team that is always up there and they're never going to drop from that, you have to remember that 10 years ago, they were not viewed as a top team. They were viewed as one of the teams, that benefited from the 2009 regulations, and they weren't quite a top team as of yet. But now, 10 years later, they are viewed as a top team. So, again, the decade of the 2010s, great for Red Bull. But for one team, it has been one gigantic failure. And that is, of course, Ferrari. This is, I believe, the first decade in Formula One history where Ferrari have not won a driver's or constructor's title. That is honestly unbelievable. And it just shows you how poor it's been. Even though there were 16 years between the constructor's title between 1983 and 99, where of course Ferrari had that long title drought, they still had won a title in the 80s and obviously won one in the 90s at the very end of the decade. But this decade, they have had nothing. And you have to blame Ferrari for this. They have no one else to blame. At the start of the decade, was basically a contrast, I think, kind of to how Ferrari were at the end of the decade, where they were unable to design a car quick enough, but trackside they were able to get results that maybe the car didn't really deserve, and they were still doing pretty good, again, trackside with strategy, and the drivers were doing well and stuff like that. But then by the end of the decade, it's reversed around, where they've got a quick enough car, but trackside, they're horrible at getting the results that they should be getting. So Ferrari just haven't been able to, mesh the two together in terms of good car and good trackside performance in terms of strategy and stuff like that. But 2010, I don't think Alonso and Ferrari deserved to win the championship that year, but they still really, in that final race, I mean, that's really where it all started, wasn't it? The disaster of the 2010s, making that horrible call to pit Fernando Alonso so early on. That, again, really started off the horrible decade. 2011, terrible car. 2012, the car was still bad, in my opinion, but Fernando Alonso dragged it into a position that was able to, still be in a position to win a championship, and Fernando Alonso didn't win it. I think, to be honest, more so bad luck than, him not being good enough in that season. But Ferrari, if Ferrari had produced a better car that season, with how good Alonso was, he probably would have won the championship that year quite comfortably. But again, poor car. 2013, again, not good enough car, and Alonso did mostly the best he could. Then they started off the V6 hybrid era in a really horrible way, with a car that looked horrible, sounded horrible, and had two drivers who looked like they hated driving the car, especially Kimi Raikkonen, as the car had no front end whatsoever. But yeah, the 2014 car was horrifically bad. And then once they got rid of the Stefano Domenicali and, Aldo Costa and people like that who were, causing the problems, I guess, we then got into the Maurizio Arriva-Bene era. And during this era, Ferrari actually improved to the level of competing for the championship, but also having a car that was a lot quicker and a lot, better for the drivers to drive. In 2015, they had a very good season in comparison to 2014, getting 3 race victories and, being a lot closer to Mercedes than they were in 2014. 2014, they were basically getting lapped or nearly lapped in certain races. In 2015, they were able to be a lot closer during the races, and pace-wise during qualifying, they were able to be a lot closer. 2016, I thought pace-wise had a good car, but they strategically got it wrong plenty of times, and then they dropped off towards the end of the season. I think that was mostly, though, because they were building for 2017. And then, as we talked about earlier, 2017 and 2018, good car, 2 good drivers, and they blew it. And they, really should have won at least one of those titles. And it is a crying shame that they didn't do that. They really had to, with the car they had and the driver they had, who, Sebastian Vettel was basically at the peak of his career, maybe the absolute end of his peak, but he was still at the peak of his career. But again, they just couldn't get it done. And then in 2019, of course, it was a laughable season. And if you want to laugh at Ferrari's 2019, then make sure to check out my 2-part review of it. It's not in the description, I don't believe, but it is on my channel, and I uploaded it earlier this month, and I know a lot of people enjoyed it quite a lot. So make sure to go and watch that. I think the 2 parts combined are about an hour and 20 minutes if you combine the 2 parts together. But yeah, this decade, I think you have to say, is the worst decade of their history. I mean, have the cars in terms of pace been as bad as other decades? Maybe not, but they have not won a title in this entire decade, and that's the first time they've ever had that. So it has to be their worst decade in Formula One, and you can't excuse that. They've had 4 chances to win a world championship in this decade: 2010, 2012, 2017 and 2018. At least one of them they should have, got the job done. But no, they failed on all 4 occasions, and let's not even talk about the constructors, because they never produced a lineup or a car combined good enough to even be close when it came to that. But yeah, Ferrari, terrible, absolutely terrible. And they want the next decade to be good or better than this decade, which is obviously the only way it can be better is if they win a championship in the 2020s, which they really should. They've got to start off the decade showing promise that things will turn at Ferrari. Things will get better. They are, as an organisation, making the changes needed to get back to winning titles, even in seasons where they're not that great. And there's been seasons like that where Ferrari have not been dominant but still won a constructors title. They need to start the decade off, kind of not quick out of the blocks, but just start it off in a way that shows promise that this team can get back to a world title winning level. Because right now, with the way 2019 has gone, I don't see this team winning a world championship for quite a long time. And of course today, and Nib, you can talk about this if you want as well, Charles Leclerc has just signed a contract until 2024 with Ferrari, which is a good decision because Leclerc, I think, clearly is now the team leader at Ferrari, because I think he's proved he's better than Sebastian Vettel and he is the future of Ferrari. But again, the next 2-3 years, the first 2 or 3 years of the decade, they've got to show something of promise, or else, Ferrari are just going to head for another decade of misery. But Nib, for Ferrari, again, so many chances and so many missed opportunities. What have you thought of their decade?
Well, I think you covered it so well. I think you've covered literally at pretty much every single talking point that there is possible to cover. But yeah, ultimately for Ferrari to not win a drivers and constructors title in this decade is ultimately embarrassing. They should have won 2012 if they just produced a better car, because it was an absolute dog of a car, and Alonso dragged it nearly to a world title. And in 2017 or 2018, they should have at least won a drivers or constructors title. I don't know how on earth they really haven't done that, or how they didn't win a constructors title or drivers in this whole entire decade. They had so many opportunities, but just they let themselves down at the end of the day, and they have to put the blame on themselves at the end of the day. Ferrari just not good enough, and I don't think that if you looked at the start of the decade, actually, well, considering 2009 was certainly not a good year for, I think that you probably could say that, Ferrari might struggle the first couple of years of the next decade, but surely they win a world title, and somehow they didn't. So, as you mentioned, they've signed Leclerc now on for another 5 years, which is so rare in the sport to see, like a 5-year deal. He's obviously the future of that team, and now Sebastian's last year in his contract, he's going to be under so much scrutiny now, and he's going to have to deliver, that's for sure, if he wants to keep his seat. But of course, we all know what I want at Ferrari for 2021, Ricciardo and Leclerc, thank you very much. But yeah, of course, it was really sad. Of course, Felipe Massa, honestly, probably my favorite driver when I started watching the sport all the way back, say, really my first race that I started watching was like 2006. So Massa was my favorite driver at that time. I'm not going to lie. And yeah, it was sad to see the downfall of Felipe Massa. Certainly in Ferrari, he started to pick it up back in the when he got back in the Williams. Of course, he got that pole at Austria in 2014, and it was great to see Felipe doing well once more. But it was also great to see Kimi back in the Ferrari. I think he just got better and better on his time back at Ferrari, if I'm going to be perfectly honest. 2018, Kimi really was absolutely superb, but yeah, Ferrari's so disappointing. They should have absolutely won a world championship, but they didn't. They absolutely were shambolic for the majority of the decade. And yeah, if they don't do better next decade, then, well, I'd be absolutely astonished.
Yeah, surely they will win one title in the next decade, even if they don't have the best car, but they just end up having a great driver combination or being more consistent. They maybe can pull off a constructors title. But again, to go an entire decade without winning a championship, and now, of course, they haven't won it in 2019, any titles. Going into 2020, that's now 12 years since their last title, which, of course, was in 2008, where they won the constructors title. And the longest title drought they've had was 16 years, between 1983, when they won the constructors, and 99, when they won the constructors. So they're not that far away from breaking the title drought and going even longer without a title than the famous one at Ferrari, when Ferrari were really seen as a joke compared to other teams, considering the amount of money and resources they had. But yeah, Ferrari, I think, as you said, Nib, 10 years ago, you would have said Ferrari, considering that we knew, they had Alonso coming to the team and Massa was still there, who was still viewed as a good driver, and you knew Ferrari had the power to pull drivers towards them, maybe a Hamilton or Vettel later on in the decade, if they really wanted them, that they would have at least got a couple in there, considering that Ferrari were not that far removed from the Michael Schumacher domination at Ferrari 10 years ago. But yeah, I think really Abu Dhabi 2010 kicked off the misery, and it just continued and never really got any better. But yeah, hopefully it does improve. But another team that I think has missed a big opportunity, and another team, by the way, that I'm not going to count the 1960s when this team started, because they didn't really do the decade. They were only in the 60s for 4 years. But if you look at McLaren, every full decade they've competed in, so starting with the 70s, this is the first decade also, they have not won a title. And that is, of course, again, McLaren. And McLaren also, this decade has to be, especially at the start of the decade, a massive missed opportunity. In 2010, at some points of the championship, they were leading 1 and 2 in the Drivers' Championship with Lewis Hamilton and Jenson Button, but then they blew it and their car was not good enough. 2012 especially. I think 2012, McLaren did something, I think, very similar to what Ferrari did in 2018. They had the car, they had the drivers, but they just couldn't, on enough occasions, get it together to get the results required to be, winning either the constructors or the drivers. And McLaren in 2012 should have won something, out of those 2 titles. They should have won something, but somehow they didn't. And then, really, the downfall of McLaren, say more the recent downfall than the long-term downfall, started when Lewis Hamilton decided to leave McLaren. And I think ever since then, I know in 2019, of course, they had a great season, but they haven't recovered since Lewis Hamilton left McLaren, because, he was their guy. He was in McLaren for so long. And I think him deciding to go to another team just kind of left McLaren a bit shell-shocked, and they didn't really know what to do for the future, because I'm sure they had Lewis Hamilton planned as, the man moving forward with the team built around him, because, of course, Lewis is younger than Jenson Button, who was his teammate at the time. But yeah, when Lewis left, I think McLaren just dropped after that. 2013, of course, and 2014. Poor car. And then once we got to 2015, the McLaren Honda days, McLaren were expected to not immediately, at least for me, they weren't immediately expected to get right back to the front of the grid. But they started off that McLaren-Honda partnership horribly by being basically a lower midfield team. 2016, they improved to being, an upper midfield team some of the time. But then 2017 was so immensely poor, they had to get rid of Honda. And then in 2018, that was really what I hope we look upon in the future as the crossroads of McLaren's, recent history. Because 2018, everyone thought McLaren would be basically how they've been this season. Front of the midfield, P7, P6, positions like that, and comfortably getting P4 in the constructors. That's what people thought McLaren were going to do. And 2018, I honestly thought was worse than 2017, because they had more going for them, more expected of them. And they did horribly compared to those expectations and, again, comparisons to Honda. And again, McLaren, I think at this point, 2018, hit a crossroads where they had to, at this point, start making the necessary steps to improve. Because if McLaren had continued in the direction they were going in, then in 2019, McLaren would have been maybe not worse, but basically the same, maybe slightly better. And then going into the 2020s, I don't think McLaren would have that much confidence going into the new era of Formula One, of course, 2021. But with the appointments of James Key, Andreas Seidel, with Zach Brown, restructuring the team to, to fit, I guess, the era of Formula One right now in a better way, McLaren are now in a better position going into the new era. And of course, they will be returning, to their partnership with Mercedes-Benz in 2021. So McLaren have, ended the decade, not better than they started it, of course, but they are looking a lot better now than they were 1 year ago, 2 years ago, even 3 or 4 years ago. And that is a positive thing to see. But at the end of the day, McLaren, like Ferrari, should have won at least one title during this decade. And really 2012 was the year where McLaren should have got it done, because they had the best car that season and rarely, got the results to show for it. But yeah, nib for McLaren. Again, ended the decade well, but similar to Ferrari, not as bad, but they've missed quite a few opportunities, haven't they?
Yeah, well, I think that, McLaren, they absolutely should have won the world title in 2012. They had the fastest car the majority of the season, but the reliability issues and other issues really, really cost them ultimately. And I think that when you say they missed out on opportunities, well, they certainly did. They had Fernando Alonso and Jenson Button as their driver partnership for a few years, and to have such an awful car, an awful engine that they did at that time, hashtag believe in McLaren Honda, it was absolutely shambolic, and their performance in this decade simply hasn't been good enough. Of course, this year has been an upturn, but still nowhere near where McLaren should be, up near the front of the sport. That I agree with you when you're talking about Hamilton. I don't think anyone in the team expected Hamilton to leave. He'd been brought up by the team. He was their child almost. He was their driver, and to see him leave the team, I think really did make McLaren just freeze. They just like, what has actually just happened? And you've seen from 2013, they went with that radical car design. They had Perez in there with Button, and it really went all downhill from there. Of course, they'd got a podium with K-Mag and Button in Australia, but after that, it just really, really was awful. Even with the Mercedes engine in 2014, they were bad. 2015, of course, then they got the Honda engine in. They were awful. 2016 wasn't better. 2017 wasn't better. And 2018 wasn't any better at all. It really has been probably the worst decade that McLaren's had in the sport. And yeah, it's been sad to see, but McLaren is certainly on the upwards trajectory, which is good to see. But yeah, an ultimately very disappointing decade for McLaren.
Yeah, and I think another word that comes to mind is underwhelming, considering the drivers, as you mentioned. They had Alonso and Button in the same car. If you had those two drivers in the same car 10 years previous at McLaren, it would have been a unbeatable partnership, but they just didn't produce a car. I had a team behind them that was good enough to be in a world championship or race winning position, and it is really sad, but it's their fault that they put themselves in those positions. But let's now get on to the next team, which is, in my OBS, I've called them Renault, but it's not really Renault, it's more the Enstone-based team, because of course they were Lotus before Renault. And quite an unusual decade for them, because they started off the decade as Renault, and in 2010 they were pretty good. Probably could have won a race if things had all clicked in place for them with Robert Kubica, who was amazing that season. But yeah, 2010 was a good season for Renault, definitely better than season than they had in 2009. 2011, I think because of Kubica's rally accident, they were never really going to have a good season, because Kubica wasn't in the car, to be able to drag out the performance he normally could at the time. The 2011 was a transition year, as they left off with drivers Petrov, Heidfeld, Senna, and then brought in Kimi Räikkönen. back to the sport. And Romain Grosjean, who of course drove for the team when they were Renault back in 2009, and they were now the Lotus Renault team. Now, 2012 and 2013, I don't think they really could have ever won the World Championship, because I think there were too many races where they just weren't quite in there consistently. They didn't have a consistently great car in qualifying the race at most weekends. They were kind of hit and miss. They'd be not so good in qualifying, but in the race they'd be amazing. There was too much of that going on, but they did have a car that was very good in 2012 and 2013. Plenty of times in 2012, they could fight for victory. I remember Bahrain, Raikkonen really should have won that race, but didn't quite go for the move on Vettel. Valencia, I remember that season, they were very quick. Of course, Abu Dhabi, Raikkonen won the race. But I think if you look at 2012 and 2013 again, Lotus could have won a lot more races if they just had, I guess, a better team with that type of car they had, pace-wise. They built a very quick car, but I just don't think as a team they were quite good enough to get the best out of it. And I think they definitely could have got more out of it during that time period. But then, because they had the Renault power unit, 2014 was a nothing season. They also did kind of contribute to it because they went with that horrible front wing design that thankfully they got rid of by the very end of the season and then going into 2015. 2015, of course, they had Mercedes power, which I think saved the team, honestly, that they got that power unit in, because if they had another season with Renault, then I think they would have probably gone out of business before the season finished, because they wouldn't have got the results to, to really keep up in Formula One. Of course, they had that podium with Romain Grosjean, one of the best moments of the decade, in my opinion, his podium at Spa in 2015. And then, of course, after that, the end of 2015, going into 2016, Lotus became Renault once again, how they started the decade, of course. And Renault, I don't think, well, personally, I was not putting that much pressure on Renault, because for a works team, when you come into Formula One like Mercedes did, or when BMW bought Sauber, or when, Renault bought Benetton at the start of the 2000s, it takes time to go from, say, midfield or lower midfield to the front of the grid, or, into a position to finish on the podium or win a race. But I thought Renault, by, maybe not by now, but by, say, 2020 or, 2021, Renault would be looking to be in a regular podium or maybe even race-winning position, but it just hasn't happened, has it, for Renault? 2016, they couldn't really do anything because the car was already designed by the people at Lotus. And of course, they went back to the Renault engine because it's now, of course, Renault. So the power was less, so they couldn't offset that design with power because they didn't have it. And then in 2017, with the new regulations, improved a lot. They did well. 2018, I think, again, improved. Especially constructors' position, they improved. And going into 2019, because Renault had made continuous improvement year upon year, we all thought Renault wouldn't, win a race, or maybe we thought we'd get a podium, but we didn't think Renault were going to be fighting Red Bull at every Grand Prix, even though there were a couple races in 2019 where they actually were just as quick, if not faster. But I think 2019... was a year where they had to show that they were closing the gap to the top three teams, and they didn't. They didn't close the gap at all. They looked the same, if not slower, compared to the top teams in 2019, and have ended off the decade in a way that they really, they had to end the decade well to show the Renault board and the people, putting money into this project that Renault are going to be at a race-winning level in a couple years' time. May still happen, of course. Stranger things have happened. Brawn GP. Who would have thought that would have happened? But again, Renault have ended the decade in a way that just isn't satisfying, especially for people who wanted to see Renault eventually get back into a podium or race-winning position. And it is sad, honestly, because this team really should be back in that position, but they're not. and they're not really close at this moment of time. But hopefully in 2020 and 2021 they can improve, and I think they can. I think if this team keeps going as the Renault Works team into maybe 2022 or 2023, they commit for that long, then I think Renault honestly can eventually by that time get into a position where they can go for podiums on a regular basis. But you just wonder how much, I guess, patience the Renault board will have, and I don't think they're going to be that patient, especially considering how they've acted in the past with pulling Renault, in and out of Formula One. So the next decade, especially the start of it, is critical for Renault if they want to stay in the sport and be a success again, which, to be honest, is not looking that. It's not looking like a sure thing that Renault will get back there. But yeah, Nib for Renault. Again, as I said, kind of a weird decade going between different names, different teams. But I think this decade, it's been kind of okay, hasn't it, for the Enstone team?
Yeah, it's been a very meh decade, that's for sure. Of course, Petrov he got a podium in Australia in 2010, wasn't it? Yeah, I remember that. That was an absolute madness that Petrov had somehow got a podium in 2010. I think of course, we all remember how good they were in 2012, 2013. They were so good on their tyres, and that brought them a lot of good results. So many times they were on the podium with Grosjean and Raikkonen challenging the Red Bulls, and perhaps if Grosjean didn't crash into everyone on the first lap in 2012, they could have had some more stronger results. When everyone else was struggling on the tyres, they were really, really good on the tyres. And when there was that sort of cliff that Pirelli had back in those days, it really, really did help them. Of course, going back just before they turned into Lotus, so sad with Kubica in his rally accident, because I really think that Renault could have had a super, super strong time in the sport. And imagine if they had Kubica and Raikkonen on the same team. I think that could have been some special partnership at that team. And then you go through, that torrid time where they had Maldonado and Grosjean as drivers. And it's certainly gotten a lot better for them since then. Would have had Sainz and Hulkenberg and now Ricciardo. They've certainly had a much stronger driver lineup. The results haven't been as good as what they've hoped for. That is for sure, but I'm sure that Renault really could get back to where they sort of belong in the next couple of years. But time will tell. I think we're seeing that. Oh dear, JB's actually just reminded me chat. Jolyon Palmer.
Yeah.
If you want to speak about banter era, that is prime banter era. One season I had Kevin Magnussen and Jolyon Palmer. I felt sorry for Kevin Magnussen that season because, he's a lot better driver than Jolyon Palmer. And anytime Jolyon Palmer, I remember, got in like a good points paying position, he'd always make a mistake. I remember in Hungary, he was in 10th, then spins at turn 4, boom, out of the points. It was absolute. That 2016 season was absolute peak Renault banter. And they've certainly come a long way from then. They're still not where they really should be, but it's certainly not as bad as what it was then. Just in the early part of the decade, they were a good team, very, very good team with Kubica, Grosjean, Raikkonen when they were Lotus, but it certainly hasn't got any better as they've gone throughout the decade. So yeah, it actually probably, you say average, but it's very below average decade for Renault, if I'm perfectly honest.
Yeah, it definitely could have been better. I think it's kind of a result of Renault. I think, when they became Lotus of the post-Crashgate scandal, they didn't really seem to want to commit as a works team anymore. And then when they came back into Formula One, even though, of course, they were an engine supplier, I think if Renault pull out in a couple years' time and they haven't got a podium still by that time, I think one thing I'll have to say, which I think is kind of true, is that they came back in as a works team kind of at the wrong time because of the lack of power they've had during this period. But yeah, Renault have got to make the next decade better because, yeah, even though, of course, they supplied Red Bull for 4 years, I'll be honest, I don't think Renault contributed that much to Red Bull. I think Red Bull, honestly, would have won those 4 titles with Cosworth power. I don't think it really mattered during that period of time. But going to the next team, which is Williams, who started the decade 2010, 2011, kind of how they finished it. They were an upper midfield team, getting some good points here and there. But then 2012, of course, they had a car that could win a race, and it did with Pastor Maldonado in 2012, and that is to date their last race victory in Formula 1, the 2012 Spanish Grand Prix. But that year, again, Maldonado was up there in a few races. Remember Valencia, he was very quick. I think Abu Dhabi as well, he was in 3rd or 4th place on the grid. And Williams had a very good car that season. And I think, honestly, that season, Williams did not accomplish as much as they probably could have if they'd had 2 drivers in that car that were, consistently good. I remember pre-2012, Williams were actually trying to get Kimi Räikkönen. And I reckon if they had Räikkönen in 2012, they probably could have won maybe more than 1 race. Because I think the Williams car, when it was working and it was absolutely on it, it was a very good car. But yeah, Williams that season, obviously getting the race victory. 2013 was absolutely horrible. I think they had 1 points finish or 2 points finishes in 2021 races, which was awful. 2014, though, of course, I wouldn't say they came back, to how they were when they had BMW power or in the 90s or 80s, but they were in a position that was a lot more Williams, if you know what I mean. Because they were able to go for podium finishes. They were able to, as Nib said earlier, go for pole position. Austria, they locked out the front row. And I remember that weekend because that was such a special weekend to see a team that was, unable to go for victories for so long to finally get back into that position and to be where they more so deserve to be. And that weekend, to be honest, I think they really could have won that race, but I just don't think they had quite the car in the race or maybe the drivers to get the job done. But yeah, Williams 2014 were very good. 2015, they dropped off a bit, but they were still competitive. And then in 2016, they lost a couple positions in the constructors. And I think really 2016 was the real start of the downfall. I mean, 2015 they did drop off, but they were still competitive with Ferrari at plenty of races during that season. They were able to fight with them at plenty of races. In 2016, they were not able to compete at all, really, with Ferrari. And then once we got into the new technical regulations in 2017, Williams dropped off again. And then into 2018, of course, they finished last in the constructors for the first time in their history, I think. And then this season has been their worst season in Formula 1. And I don't see it getting any better. And I'm going to say it now. Williams will not finish the 2020 decade. They will not be in Formula 1. In this time in 10 years' time, they will not be in Formula 1. Guarantee it. They will not be in Formula 1. They are going the same way as the Jordan team. A team that, Jordan weren't winning championships, but, a team that used to be competitive in the midfield, upper midfield, but just, very quickly in a 2 or 3, 4 year period, drop off to the back of the grid. And yeah, Williams have done basically the same thing. And I don't think this team will survive the 2020 decade. I don't think they will. I think maybe they have a chance of getting bought out by another company and then it becoming, another name. But the Williams team, I'm guaranteeing you this now, will not finish the decade. They will not do it because I do not think this team has anything more to give. I don't see it. I don't see how this team improves. Next year, they should start the season off with a better car, but they're still not going to be competitive. The whole budget cap thing for 2021 is not going to be an immediate good thing for Williams because it's going to take 2 or 3 years to take effect. To really affect Mercedes, Ferrari, Red Bull, Renault, teams like that. So Williams, again, I just don't see where this team goes. I think they're done in Formula 1. And I think really, the management of Claire Williams has finished them off. And it's a sad thing to say, but Williams are done. They're done in Formula One. I don't see any future for them. Nib, for their decade, highs and lows for them. At the moment, it's a massive low. But also, as you review the decade, do you think Williams will, in 10 years' time, be in Formula One as the Williams team?
Right, well, we'll start. Well, I can't honestly even. Oh, well, of course, 2010 Williams, Hulkenberg. Really should have won in Brazil, if I'm perfectly honest. Of course, incredible that he got that pole position, but he threw it away with that crash at Hamilton at turn 1 in 2010. Geez, that is a long, long time ago now. Blimey.
Wasn't that 2012 with Force India? I think it was 2012.
Oh, yeah, that's right. He
Yeah.
did get pole though.
Yeah, he did.
He did
in 2010.
pole in 2010. Yeah, I know. Sorry, I'm absolutely destroyed at the moment, to be honest with you. But yeah, we'll get through this. The 2012, of course, Maldonado wins somehow, and then of course afterwards, their garage goes on fire. That was not so fun. And of course, under the watchful eye of Toto Wolff, that those years was that year was done under. But then of course he was taken from Williams. He went to Mercedes, and look out where Mercedes have gone from there. Absolutely incredible. And imagine if Toto Wolff hadn't stayed at Mercedes. But of course, why would you say no to Mercedes if you're Toto Wolff? And then of course 2014 Austria got front row lockout, but I think 2014 the main thing that we've kind of forgotten here when speaking about this is Silverstone. They should have won that Grand Prix. They absolutely bottled the strategy after somehow getting into a 1-2 position with Felipe Massa and Valtteri Bottas at the start. They had those absolute rocket ship starts. It's like they sprayed some Rexona in the exhaust and it gave them an extra boost at the start. I don't know what on earth, but incredible start they had. They just absolutely bottled the strategy, and in the end, Hamilton did end up winning that Grand Prix. 2015, they were still able to challenge for podiums. I remember Bottas got a podium at Canada, it was, but then after that, it really just did get worse for them. 2016 was another step backwards. In 2017, 2018, and 2019, all dreadful years at the end of the day. Of course, Lance Stroll still got a podium in Baku in 2017, and then it's been quite an interesting couple of seasons for Williams. Certainly ended on a massive low. Nearly got 1 point this year with Robert Kubica at Hockenheim, even though Russell out-qualified him, 21-0 in qualifying. Absolutely hilarious that Kubica ended up getting the point over Russell. But yeah, and to answer your question, which you started off with, I really do hope that we see Williams at the end of the decade because, well, you know, I think we all want Williams to stay around, but it really would be hard. It really would be. It's hard to see Williams at the end in the sport still, just as Williams at the end of the decade. I really, really do hope that it happens because they're such an iconic and legendary team, but it's going to be tough for them, that's for sure. But who knows? Hopefully they can start to get in the right direction in the first couple of years of the decade, and who knows, they could then start to get themselves back up in at least in the midfield pecking order.
Yeah, hopefully they can. And when I say, I don't think they'll last a decade, I'm not hoping they, don't last a decade. I want Williams to go on, honestly, forever in Formula One. But if you look at the situation, I just don't see how it's possible for them to last if they continue the way they're going. And if you look at Williams at the moment, they're not doing, say, what McLaren are doing and restructuring the team. They're not doing that. And until Williams go for a major restructure of the team, I don't think Williams are going anywhere. And yeah, you can say Williams have not got the money, and that is true. But you cannot tell me Williams, with the amount of money and resources they have, are doing the best they can. They're not. They're absolutely not doing the best they can. Because 10 years ago, they didn't have that much money, and they were an upper midfield team. So, you know, I mean, I know Formula One costs a lot more money today to run a team, but they were still a small team in comparison to your Ferraris, McLarens, even Red Bull at the time, because of course Red Bull are a drinks company, so can pump a lot more money in, even when they're not that competitive in Formula One. They were still doing well. I mean, you know, look at 2015 or 2016. They, in comparison to Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren, Honda, given, you know, the money they gave to McLaren, Red Bull, Renault, still had a big deficit in money available, but Williams were still able to be right up there. So I'm afraid there is absolutely no excuses. And yeah, if they don't have a major restructure, I don't see how this team really recovers. Just want to respond to one person though in the chat called I don't know if he's responding to us. I'm going to assume he is because he would have added someone in the chat. It's John Cale, who says, or I think he's trying to make out that we've said that Ferrari were terrible, but Renault were okay and McLaren were decent. What are you smoking? Well, we didn't call McLaren decent. We said they were disappointing and underwhelming. And Renault, I mean, if you look at Renault, the majority of the decade they've been in the midfield. So that's what we're comparing them to. We're not comparing them to the top of the field. I mean, yeah, Renault should be at the front of the grid or near the front of the grid, but the majority of the decade, Renault or the Enstone-based team have been a midfield team. So compared to the midfield, they've done okay, nothing special. And then he goes on to say, let me just find this other one. I can. John Kell says, Ferrari were amazing compared to McLaren or Renault, but they make it sound like Ferrari were an unmitigated disaster. They were clear third best team. If you honestly think that's an achievement, then you don't understand Ferrari or Ferrari's, I guess, role in Formula One. Ferrari are not in Formula One to be the third best team and to qualify on the third row of the grid at every, single Grand Prix. Yeah, they are better than Renault and McLaren, but so what? That's not, you've got to be. You can't just look at one or two teams, oh, they're better than these teams, and, that means they're good. No. I mean, yeah, McLaren have been a big rival of Ferrari, but it's not exactly been hard, has it, to be better than McLaren in the last few years. Even teams like Force India or even Haas F1 have been better than McLaren. So, yeah, again, Ferrari, you cannot give me any real reason or a good example of why Ferrari have not been a disaster this decade and why it's not been a disaster in the 2010s. It's Ferrari. They are the biggest team in Formula One in terms of, their stature within the sport. Financially, yeah, they don't have the most money. I think Mercedes still do, but they have no excuses to not win a title in 10 years or 12 years. It's Ferrari. I think Ferrari, honestly, is a completely different beast compared to a team like Renault or a company like Renault and even at times like McLaren. So, yeah. But anyway, we've got 4 more teams to go. We've got Force India, then we've got Sauber, Toro Rosso, and then Haas. So, nearly done, guys. I know we've been going over 2 hours, but we're nearly done. Now let's get on to Force India. Of course, now Racing Point, but let's be honest, they've been Force India. In the 2010s, start the decade, I thought they were doing very well compared to other teams, considering the amount of money they had. I think they finished 7th, in the Constructors in 2010, but then bettered it to 6th in 2011. And actually, were doing, at the end of 2011, better than teams like Renault or even Mercedes-Benz at times, even though they had a lot less money to be able to do that. Then in 2012 or 2013, they made progress. 2013, they really should have beat McLaren in the Constructors, but I think McLaren just developed better over the season. And then into the V6 hybrid era, Force India really became a force, no pun intended, because Perez got their first podium since Fisichella, I think, in 2009 in Bahrain. And that season, Force India were kind of the same as 2013, probably a bit better, but in terms of position, they did the same. And then 2015, I think, was a turning point of the decade because they started the season 2015 with a pretty poor car. Then they brought out the B-Spec car. And from that point on, up until really the end of 2017, they never dipped in performance. They ended 2015 as one of the top 5 best teams in Formula One. 2016, of course, they got 2 podiums, I think, and they finished P4 in the constructors. And then 2017, they dominated the midfield battle in what was probably their best season in Formula One. 2017. I know, 2016 they had a couple podiums, but I think if you look at the season as a whole, pace-wise, Force India in 2017 had the best car basically at every Grand Prix in the midfield. So yeah, great season there. Then 2018 was another turning point going into the next decade because, of course, financial troubles, change of ownership had occurred in 2018 that caused the team to not be as good in 2018 because, of course, they couldn't develop as much. And then the second half of 2018 became Racing Point, and in 2019, of course, a Racing Point as well, and have suffered since the ownership, the new ownership, a lack of development, but they are seemingly getting better at that as time goes on. And I'm hoping that this team that is now Racing Point going into the 2020s can get back to how they were around the mid part of this decade, because I think even though they don't have the money maybe to beat teams like Renault and McLaren, in terms of quality and effort, they are one of the best teams in Formula One, no doubt about it. If you gave every team the same amount of money and resources, Racing Point would be right up there fighting for podiums and victories. I have no doubt about it whatsoever. Every season, really, they've been able to get great results out of cars that are not that quick, or not as quick as the results they've got. They've been doing it for 10 years, and they seemingly will continue to do it. So the hope is, going into the next decade, that Racing Point will use the money of Lawrence Stroll well, building their new, I think they're building a new wind tunnel, I think in 2020 or 2021, something like that. Obviously, new factory. Hopefully they use all those things well, because I think this team, if 2021 works out well for the budget cap and they can continue to progress as a team, don't count them out for more podiums or maybe even that elusive race victory. I honestly think it could happen. Maybe not with Perez or Stroll, because they are, Perez, even though he's very good, he's getting on a bit. Stroll, I'm not sure he's got that quality to win a race, but maybe, if they throw a exciting new young driver in there in the mid part of the next decade and, they're in a position to maybe go for a podium or maybe even more, you never know. It could happen. So don't count them out. They are one of the best performing teams in Formula One, no doubt about it. And Nib, for this decade, considering the amount of money they do have, despite what's happened with, the financial takeover in 2018, I think, honestly, you'd have to say it's been a great decade. If Nib is there. There he is.
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry. I don't see my... I don't really know what to say about Racing Point, Force India. I think you basically said it all. Really from 2015 onwards did they really start to perform at a super high level for the budget that they had. Ever since they brought that like B-spec car at Hungary, they really did improve. That's for sure. For the resources that they have, absolutely. I think this is the best way. The pound for pound, one of the best teams in the sport. I still think if you gave everyone the same resources, they'd still be behind Mercedes and Red Bull, but they're certainly up there as one of the best well-run teams in the sport. They've had some fantastic drivers, of course, with Hülkenberg through the years, with Perez. Perez, absolutely one of the best drivers in the midfield, and I think with Perez and hopefully if Stroll can get his act together, I think that they can have a very successful decade with more money, with more backing from Lawrence Stroll, and hopefully, who knows, even an exciting partnership with Aston Martin, if that ever eventuates, So I think that the next decade could bring some very, very exciting things for Racing Point.
Yeah, it could. And by the way, with the Aston Martin thing, that's actually a reoccurring story, because if anyone remembers, around the Austrian Grand Prix of 2016, I remember I was watching Sky Sports News at the time, and there was a breaking news story that Force India were in serious discussions with Aston Martin for a takeover. So this has been in the works for quite a long time. And I'm hoping it does, work out for them, because if they can get those types of sponsorships, brand deals, title sponsors, whatever you want to call them, it will help this team financially get to higher positions that they do deserve to be in. Because as Nib says, pound for pound, they're right up there. It's one of the best teams. And definitely, if you gave them the same money as Ferrari, this team would do better than Ferrari would. No doubt about it. The current Ferrari team, they're really midfield at best in terms of quality, and this team I think definitely is one of the best in Formula 1, so hopefully that all does work out for them. Next up we got Sauber. Now Sauber, of course, started the decade in a bit of turmoil because BMW had abruptly left at the end of 2009 through, well, they say it's because of the financial crisis. I think it's more embarrassment that 2009 failed so hard, because they gave up on development so early on in 2008 when they had the chance to go for the championship, because they thought in 2009 they were going to be great, and they were horrible. And the curse system they, were so confident about, they ended up taking off their car, I think, because it failed so much. So I think BMW left out of shame and disappointment, to be honest. But yeah, for Sauber at the start of the decade, things were not looking that great, because now they didn't have BMW there, and they were back to being little old Sauber like they were in the early 2000s. And they had, Kobayashi, Perez, De La Rosa for the first couple of years, and it, again, wasn't looking that great. But then once we got to 2012 and 2013, Sauber were getting back to kind of like when they had Raikkonen and Heidfeld and Massa at the team, where they were able to fight consistently, for points finishes, but also they were able to get that surprise podium or a surprise qualifying position. And in 2012, of course, they had an amazing season. That was their best season in Formula 1, no doubt about it. Perez had, 3 podiums, should have won the Malaysian Grand Prix, had his engineer not told him anything. Canada, he qualified 15th and finished in 3rd, and then Monza came from near the back of the grid and finished in P2 and almost won the Grand Prix. So yes, Sauber that season, great. Kobayashi also had a podium at his home race at Suzuka, and 2012, without a doubt, is their best season in the sport. I know people will say, but BMW Sauber, for me, does not count as Sauber. That is BMW. I do not count that as Sauber, the Peter Sauber F1 team, or the Manisha Kaltenborn Sauber team. But then after 2012, 2013 was okay. First half of the season was poor, second half was better. But then Sauber really fell into a crisis, because in 2014 they were non-existent. I mean, can anyone even remember what their car looked like? It was that bad of a season. 2015 was better. They finished, I think, 6th or 7th in the Constructors, which wasn't too bad at the time. They had a couple good results. But then 2016 and 17, this team was looking in a dire situation, because they were financially in a lot of trouble. There are drivers in the car that were good, but not good enough, or not, going to drag them out of the mess they were in. And they were fighting teams that they shouldn't be fighting. I mean, you can see on your screen, this is 2016, where they were fighting Renault, who were also at the back of the grid. But they were fighting teams they shouldn't have been fighting. Manor, for example. I mean, if Felipe Nasr had not finished P9 at his home race in that season, I'm not sure Sauber would be on the grid, because they gained a lot of money from finishing P9 in, or P10 or whatever it was in the Constructors. No, second last. So that was a massive result for this team. Then 2017, they were in a dire mess, finishing last in the Constructors. But then Ferrari helped out this team a lot by bringing in Alfa as a title sponsor, and then later on as, you know, the name of the team, or being the team, even though they're still kind of Sauber, just with Alfa Romeo branding and the name. They improved again. 2018 was good. 2019 could have been better, but was still, I guess, okay in comparison to what they've been doing as of late. But I think this team, they can at the moment look upon the decade in a positive way because of how they've ended it, because it wasn't looking like they were going to end the decade at all in Formula 1. So that is nice to see that Sauber did hang on and become Alfa Romeo. But this team might become Sauber again, because there are rumours that Sauber, or the people there, do not want to be Alfa anymore, and they want to be Sauber again and go their own direction for the 2021 and stuff like that. So we'll see what happens. But kind of a very up and down decade. Again, they started off at a bit of a worrying point, then hit their peak in 2012, and then the mid part of the decade looked as though they were gone, and then they've ended it in a much stronger position. I don't think we can doubt that whatsoever. Nib for Sauber. It is nice to see this team, you know, still in Formula 1, because I'm not sure 10 years ago, after BMW left, you would have said that they'd still be in the sport. Hold on. Is he there? Oh, Nib is still muted. He's probably fallen asleep. Nib, are you there? I think he's fallen asleep. Well, if he has, then I think we'll just move on to probably the next team. I'll give him a few more seconds if he can unmute himself. But let me just quickly read the chat to see what you guys are saying. Yeah, as Jamie said, poor lad. He has been awake for quite a long time. If you don't know, and I'm going to plug it for him now that he's probably asleep, he has a Twitch channel called Niblo331. So if you want to watch some Rainbow Six and you want to watch Nib with face cam and everything playing and having fun, then go ahead and do that. He streams quite often. Just make sure you follow him on Twitter, and he'll post out the link plenty of times to his, you know, channel page. But right, I think we'll just move on to, who's the next team? Toro Rosso. Right, we'll go on to Toro Rosso then. So Toro Rosso, yeah, kind of similar to Sauber. Started off not that great with Buemi and Alguersuari in 2010 and 2011, and then 2012 they went for Ricciardo and Verne, obviously, and then I think 2012 was kind of probably their worst season in the sport, because they were very slow, and there was plenty of times where they got knocked out in qualifying 1, I think it was, at the time, in like 17th or 18th place. So they weren't that competitive at the time. But then Daniel Ricciardo, of course, had that amazing year of 2013 where he got 70 great qualifying positions, and that impressed Red Bull enough to put Ricciardo in the team. And he got put in the team, of course. And then they replaced him with Daniel Kvyat, who had a good first year. Verne had a good year as well. Toro Rosso had an okay year, I guess you could say. And then in 2015, they had Carlos Sainz and Max Verstappen, a lineup that I think many would kill to see again in Formula 1. And that year, Toro Rosso were very competitive. And I think if the two drivers had been a bit more experienced, I think they probably would have done better in the Constructors that season and would have been a bit more competitive, but they were still a bit, you know, irrational, I guess, at the time. And then into 2016 and 17, I think Toro Rosso in those seasons, especially 2016, they had a very good car, but the power was lacking. If they had the power to match the car, Toro Rosso would have took off in that time. They had a very good car aerodynamically. And then 2018, of course, new era of Honda. And it was kind of a hit and miss year, 2018, because they'd do really well at one race, so they'd be back of the grid at the next race. And then 2019, they ended off the decade almost how they ended the 2000s decade, because of course 2008, the penultimate year in that decade, They finished, what was it, P6 in the Constructors. And where else did they? And they obviously got their first race win and their only race win in 2008. And this season, of course, 2 podiums and the same position in the Constructors. I would say, though, 2008 was the better season because they won a race. You can't doubt that was the better season. But for Toro Rosso, the decade... it's been a weird decade. I think Toro Rosso just basically become the team that I think, Red Bull intended for them to become when they created them. A team for young drivers. So they were never ever going to be consistently in one position. They were going to fluctuate based on the quality of the young driver they had. It improved when Max or Carlos was in the car, dipped when Gasly was in there, then improved again when, they had better drivers back in there. But yeah, Toro Rosso, I think, could have probably accomplished more, but they're not really supposed to accomplish more. They're Toro Rosso. They're always going to be in the sport because of Red Bull. And of course, next year, they will not be Toro Rosso. They'll be Alfa Tauri. And hopefully, they go well with the new name. By the way, talking of Alfa Tauri, they've announced their car reveal date, which is Valentine's Day. Of course, February 14th. And by the way, in case you didn't know, Ferrari have also revealed their car reveal date, which is February the 11th, I believe it is. If I'm incorrect, then make sure to correct me. But those are the only 2 car reveal dates we know so far. And I'm sure during January, when we get into podcasts and streams again, that, once we know of more car reveal days, I'll be able to let you guys know of, what days or when the cars are getting revealed. And then the final team we'll go on to is Haas F1, who of course are the best new team we acquired in the 2010s decade. 2016 I thought was a good first season for them. They got a top 5 finish with Romain Grosjean, still one of their best results in Formula 1, in my opinion. That race, that weekend was amazing for Romain and the team. And of course, the first race, getting P6 in their first race, especially when they started at the back of the grid. I think they were on the back row of the grid. And they came through and got that. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. 2017, they dipped. I think that's because they had the same problems aerodynamically or braking-wise that they had the year before. But then 2018, they massively improved and they got into a position where they could fight properly in the midfield with teams like McLaren, Force India, Renault, Sauber, proper midfield teams. And it was great to see Haas right in there. And Haas really should have finished P4 in the Constructors in 2018. They had the pace, but I think because of the lack of experience, they didn't really know how to get the pace out of the car properly and put that on the track as a result, if you know what I mean. They didn't quite know how to do that, like a team like a Renault or a McLaren can do. Haas, of course, will learn that, and hopefully they do. And then, of course, 2019 was horrifically bad, and their worst season in Formula 1. We have to say it has been their worst season in Formula 1, 2019. But if they can learn the lessons of their first few years in Formula 1, then I think the next decade can be not amazing, but they can be an upper midfield team, maybe at best. Maybe nick a podium here or there. I mean, look at the amount of midfield teams who've gone through who have nicked a podium. Sauber in 2012, Toro Rosso in 2019, Force India. So it is possible in the next decade that Haas can nick a couple podiums, their first podiums in Formula 1 and, get back up to how they were in 2018. They just need to learn from their experiences so far as a new team and then get back into that position. And if they do, then Haas F1 should be a solid midfield team, and that's what I hope they become. I mean, Haas are never going to be race-winning level unless they get away from this whole Ferrari technical partnership thing they have. But if they, continue with the technical partnership they have with Ferrari, then they're going to be a solid midfield team at best. And I think that's what they should aim for, just to be kind of like Sauber have been at their best in the past decade. A midfield team, 5th, 6th in the field, that's really, I think, the best you can expect of Haas F1. Now, the other teams that compete in the decade, I've not got pictures for because I don't really want to talk about them. I mean, HRT, horrible. Caterham, massive disappointment and horrible. The only team I do want to mention, though, is Manor. Because, of course, they had 2 points finishes, Bianchi and Monaco. And, of course, rest in peace, Jules Bianchi. Still a shame he wasn't able to fulfill his destiny and drive for Ferrari and be a race-winning driver, which I think he was going to be, without a doubt. And then Pascal Wehrlein at Austria in 2016. And I think Manor, honestly, is one of the biggest what-ifs of the decade. If, again, Felipe Nasr did not finish P9 in Brazil and Manor had got that extra, 20, 30 million? If I am wrong, make sure to correct me, but if they got that, that could have been the difference between Manor being in Formula 1 and not being in Formula 1. And I honestly think they deserve to be in Formula 1 instead of Sauber at the time. I know Sauber have gone on to better things, but Sauber were not doing well enough compared to how they were doing the year before or, in previous years. So I think that's the biggest what if or shame of the decade is Manor leaving the sport because they were great. I mean, they were the only one of those new back marker teams that actually made something out of nothing. They finally got the points finish. In 2016, they weren't a back marker team really anymore. There were some races where Manor were able to be midfield, lower midfield, which really for them, considering their finances at the time, was a massive accomplishment. So it's a shame about Manor, but that's the way Formula 1 is. Not everything works out. But I think, guys, I'll read a few comments and then we'll come to the end of the podcast. Because I have been going for 2 hours and 35 minutes, and no wonder, if Niv has fell asleep, no wonder he has, because I said to him before we started, I reckon we'll go an hour and a half tonight, and we've gone an hour extra. So, yeah, no surprise if that's what Niv has done, and I think he has, because he's gone idle on Discord, which would explain that. But, right, final couple comments. Crystal Racing, isn't it Alpha Tauri? That's not a good one. Crystal Racing also says Toro Rosso are a manifestation of what Minardi could have accomplished if Giancarlo had more money in the 90s. But if you remember, around 93, 94, Minardi were not a backmarker team. They were actually a proper midfield team, kind of like Sauber are right now. Or Alpha, whatever you want to call them. And then they dropped off because of lack of money. Around 95, 96, that's when they became that famous we are the worst team in Formula 1 team for so long, for 10 years basically. But around 94, they were pretty good. I remember, I think was it Pierluigi Martini was one of their drivers, and I think he a couple times qualified 5th or 6th for a couple races around that time. So Minardi did have quite a lot of potential there, but they just couldn't, quite get the results needed when they actually had the chance to. You know what I mean? When you get the chance, to get at that result that could transform your team and your future, you've got to get it. But they didn't quite get that. And do you think, do you guys think F1 will grow substantially over the next decade under Liberty Media? I hope so, and I think media-wise it will. In terms of the sporting side, the on-track racing, it's hard to say. It all comes down to 2021. If 2021 goes well, it'll all fall into place, and the rest of the decade should be fine. But if it doesn't go well, like 2014, and that new regulation, massive change, then Formula 1 will just go back to what it was, to what we don't want it to be, which is one team dominating, and a massive variation in pace. I mean, of course, the teams are going to have different pace, and there is going to be a dominant team or a team that wins, of course, but we don't want to see dominance and the small teams unable to ever compete. That's what they're trying to, get rid of. We're trying to create a more fair, competitive field, and that's what they've got to try and do. Because if you go back to 2012, 2013, even though there was still a pay or prize-earning gap, the midfield was able to compete with the top a lot more than they are now. And they've got, again, as I said earlier, a long time ago, 2 hours ago, they've got to get back to how it was in 2012, 2013 in terms of the on-track racing and how the midfield could compete and, could have their day in the sun a lot more on a regular basis than they do now. Crystal Racing, I think Martini qualified second alongside Senna at some race. I'm trying to think. No, it wasn't Martini. That was Stefano Modena. That was Monaco 91 in the Tyrrell. I think Honda-powered Tyrrell. Close, though. I can see why you get your Martinis and your Modenas mixed up because they sound exactly the same. But right, let's find a couple more comments. Crystal Racing 2019 Pirelli tyres will be reused for 2020, so tyre wear will be a bigger factor next year. Yes, it will. Yes, it will. And by the way, the tyre allocations have been announced for the first 4 races of 2020, and Bahrain, they have gone a step softer, so that is guaranteeing a 2-stop race at the least. Probably a 3-stop for some teams, probably, Haas F1. So look out for Bahrain. That is going to be a mental race. And then, as you say, because of the tyre wear being worse with older tyres that are built for slower cars, there'll be some races where you wouldn't think that it would be a 2-stop, but it is. So we'll see. I think definitely Shanghai will be a 2-stop at least, and then once we get to Spain, that'll probably be a 2 or 3-stop race. France will probably be a 2-stop, and then once those 2019 tyres, once the cars get faster during the season, especially at the end of the season where they get immensely quick compared to how they are at the start of the season, every race will be a 2 or 3-stop race because again, the 2019 tyres are built for slower cars. So yeah. Mango Gamer, can you do a video talking about the worst teams ever in F1? Possibly. Talking of, though, video ideas, I might as well come to the end of the stream now. Thank you guys, by the way, for watching this, I guess, marathon of a stream. Absolute marathon of a stream. 2 hours and, it's going to be 2 hours and 45 minutes, basically, for this stream. But, yeah, thank you guys for coming along. And also, again, it's the last live stream of 2019. So I just want to thank every one of you who have come along for the live streams this season. Watch-alongs, podcasts, special breaking news videos. Just thank you guys so much for being in the chat. If you've given me super chat money, thank you very, very much for that. By the way, when it comes to donations, I'm going to have some news on that soon. Before testing, I should have some news on that. Yeah, thank you guys so much, because the live streams this year have been a big thing for us, of course. We've had plenty of people watching us live, plenty of success, and hopefully it continues into 2020, and it hopefully will. But just want to let you guys know what's coming up on the channel. So my next video, because obviously Christmas Day is 2 days away, there won't be a video on the channel for 4 or 5 days probably. The next video is going to be a recorded video, obviously. Will be a review of Renault in 2019, because what I'm going to do is a similar thing to what I did with Ferrari. And that review, I'm going to do a very detailed race-by-race look at how it fell apart, because I don't think Renault should be allowed to get away with it, if you know what I mean. Because I think people are allowing Renault to get away with it. They shouldn't be allowed to, because 2019 has been a poor season, I think, in comparison to how it should have been. And then the final video will probably come out on the 30th of December. And that video will be a thank you for 2019, and it will also be a highlights of the year. So it'll basically be highlights of my watch-alongs, or our watch-alongs this year. So you'll get to hear me and Nib screaming at certain points of the season or ranting and raving when things have not gone our way. Or not our way, but Canada, for example, when we were ranting and raving, you'll get to hear all of that again and hear the best parts of the year on the channel. And then, obviously, we'll be into the new year. And then in the new year, guys, in January, all I'm going to do is 2020 preview stuff. There will be some content that won't be 2020 or necessarily all about 2020, but most of it will be, previewing talking points of 2020. Can Hamilton do it yet again in 2020? Will Max compete for his first ever world championship? Can Ferrari not be bad? I guess you could say. Also, I'm planning another video about Ferrari that may be a review of their decade, because I think you guys would enjoy that. Me intensely going over their decade and how poor it's been. I think you guys would like that. So I am making plans for that in case I do that. And then, maybe I'll do a video about McLaren or Renault and stuff like that. And of course, once we get into February, it'll be car reveals and then testing. By the way, guys, I haven't actually got my tickets yet, but I am going to be going to testing, just to let you guys know, in case you didn't know. I will be going to testing for the full first and second test. So just want to make that clear. I'll be going to testing and covering it properly this time. And then, we'll be into the season. But again, thank you guys for coming along, watching the podcast. Don't forget to subscribe. Bottom right of the screen, you can do it right there. And also, you can do it on the homepage by clicking on my channel name, going there and subscribing. Hit the notifications bell for more content like this. Hit the like button. Comment down below what you thought of this video, and comment down below what your thoughts of the 2010s decade are. And then also, do not forget to join my Discord, because for 2020, if you want the best possible way for notifications of my videos and streams, that Discord server is the best place, without a shadow of a doubt. So don't forget to join that. Follow me on Twitter at Chaz6110. Check out my website, ChazzaHDF1 for more content like this. And then also, what else? My Facebook, of course. Don't forget to like me on Facebook. ChazzaHDF1 is on Facebook. Don't forget to like the page also for more content like this. But guys, until my next live stream, which will probably be, say, mid-January-ish, where we'll probably go over, I don't know, the latest news or the news since we, did our last live podcast. Until then, which will be the next podcast and live stream, until my next video, which will be around the 27th or 28th of December, and until 2020, the new decade, which hopefully in Formula One will be a better decade and will be a decade of thrilling action, new world champions, new race winners for teams and drivers. Until then, guys, it has been me, ChazzaHD. Goodbye.